Chapter 631. It was quiet inside and outside the house. The only thing that could be felt was the invisible tension that was getting tenser and tenser. Supreme Lord Tianlan was still as calm as the ocean. Other than scanning the surrounding walls and following the occasional strange and light sounds that came from outside the house, he did not do anything else. However, the murderous aura outside the house was getting stronger and stronger. It was like the raging waves of an enraged ocean, each wave stronger than the one before it. The invisible waves seemed to be rising higher and higher, as if they would rush into the house in the next moment, drown and destroy everything here. However, the house was still there. The waves of almost hallucinatory murderous aura filled the surroundings but did not cause any substantial movement. Standing in the house, Supreme Lord Tianlan suddenly lowered his head and took a look. The wide sleeves of his robe fluttered slightly even though there was no wind. The admiration in his eyes grew stronger and he even nodded slightly. At the same time, the murderous aura around him had almost reached its peak inside and outside the house. It was as if a huge wave had rushed up to the sky and gathered into an incomparably huge peak. Just as it was about to crash down and explode all the forces in the house, time suddenly seemed to freeze at that moment. All the murderous aura suddenly disappeared completely, as if someone had woken up from a dream. Everything was just an illusion and disappeared without a trace. At the moment when the heavy hammer was about to fall, at the moment when the violent force was about to explode, everything suddenly disappeared. It was really quiet outside the house. There was no sound, no movement, not even the invisible murderous aura. Everything became empty as if nothing had ever existed. It was as if what happened just now was just an inadvertent illusion of Supreme Lord Tianlan. The house was still very quiet. White Lotus was still lying on the ground, and it was unknown whether she was dead or alive. Supreme Lord Tianlan was still standing there alone. His wide sleeves made him look up to him like a majestic mountain. His expression was still calm, without any shock or sorrow. Of course, there were no emotions like fear or dread. However, the smile on his lips faded, and the gratification and admiration in his eyes faded. He stared at the wall. Although there were bricks in the way, it seemed that he could still see through it. Even though he was a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, at this moment he could still clearly feel the terrifying difference. The violent moment suddenly turned into nothingness. It was a power that seemed invisible but could affect the soul. It was a level beyond the imagination of ordinary cultivators. It was a rare and profound will to rein in the horse at the edge of life and death. He was indeed the most outstanding shadow. In the end, he still remembered that the shadow's greatest strength was not the vastness of the raging waves, but the soundless glimmer of light in the dark shadows. He lurked in the shadows. When he was not in sight, he was always indescribably terrifying, even for a soul formation perfected cultivator. Yes, at this moment, perfected Lord Tianlan truly felt threatened for the first time. That was the disciple that he admired the most, trusted the most, and had placed the highest hopes on. He was a good disciple that he had personally taught. His gaze was somewhat cold. Lu Qin, who was outside the house, had used some weird secret method to completely conceal his aura like a ghost at this moment. Supreme Lord Tianlan could feel that Lu Qin should still be somewhere outside the house, but for the first time he lost control of Lu Qin's exact location. This was a very rare thing for him. Of course, this was also because he had secretly suppressed his own cultivation. He was an extremely powerful person. As long as he released his senses without any scruples, it was almost impossible for anyone near him to hide their traces. However, under such a powerful and magnificent aura, ordinary cultivators might not be able to sense it, but in the eyes of the shadow who had gone through special and harsh training, he was like a blazing sun. It was impossible to hide his identity. However, he still did not want Lu Qin to know that he was here at this moment. He was still a little curious about this disciple of his. He wanted to know what kind of abilities and trump cards this man, who had many fetters with him and appeared to be gentle and respectful but was actually arrogant and unruly in the depths of his heart, had. He really wanted to see. Therefore, he still stood quietly and waited patiently, waiting for the shadow to strike with the breath of death that he did not know when would come amidst the silence. For a moment, a somewhat strange thought suddenly flashed across his mind. He thought of many years ago in that desolate valley, when the ancient magic formation was activated by the elders of the devil cult, and when the shadow that had been hiding for many years appeared behind them and delivered the final fatal blow. What did those people feel? Would there be a day when he would also experience such a state of mind? He waited patiently as if he did not care about life or anything else, and was only left with curiosity. The silence outside the house seemed to last for a very long time, but it also seemed like a blink of an eye. In that tense and empty atmosphere, there seemed to be an invisible force constantly attacking one's mind and perception, constantly producing all kinds of illusions. Then, after the silence that made one feel lost and silent, suddenly, a voice rang out from somewhere on the wall. It was extremely soft, almost the same as before, as if someone had touched the wall with his fingers. There was almost no sound at all, except for a terrifying figure like Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze instantly shifted over. At that moment, his perception was immediately magnified, and almost in the blink of an eye, he caught the breath that had suddenly disappeared. His lips curled into a smile again, and his expression became gentle once more. He looked like an adult looking at a stubborn child who was playing around with a bit of affection. However, at this moment, suddenly, on the opposite wall from where the voice had just come from, the wall that Perfected Lord Tianlan's back was facing, a sound also rang out. Pa! It was extremely soft, and almost inaudible, except for figures like Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression instantly froze, and he almost subconsciously looked back with a bit of astonishment. However, when he turned his head halfway, he frowned as if he had sensed something, and his body suddenly froze. At that moment, it was as if the world had stopped and time had frozen for a moment. Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure stood alone in the house. There seemed to be a gust of wind blowing outside the house, and in the house with its doors and windows tightly shut, his large sleeve seemed to flutter slightly. Time was like a surging river, and someone was faintly looking at him from the depths of the river. In the crack of time and space, the bald man also seemed to be looking sideways, staring at the place where the invisible light and shadow intersected. He seemed to be looking at himself, but it also seemed like it wasn't him. Perhaps it was just his past and future self, who knew? Then he suddenly raised his head as if he had beaten time to it. The moment his head turned, it was as if a force had suddenly shattered the piece, completely destroying the disorderly illusion, making the bald man seem to have beaten time to it. He raised his head and looked over. Boom! A loud sound rang out and dust flew everywhere. The two walls that had echoed the sound were fine, but above his head, there was a huge hole in the roof. Someone descended from the sky, and his killing intent was like a tide, bursting forth violently. With a suffocating momentum, he went straight for his head. Chapter 632. It was as if a stormy sea had rolled up a raging wave, crashing down from above. The sound of the wind was so strong that it seemed as if the house was about to be torn apart. The violent wind blew everything in the house to the left and right. Even White Lotus, who had fainted on the ground, was blown away a few times. The wind rolled up into a whirlpool, whistling and surging. However, in the eye of the storm, the tall and burly man still stood there. Although his sleeves were also fluttering, his body was towering and unmoving. His face was calm and indifferent, and his gaze seemed to be deep and distant, hiding an unknown emotion. In the fierce wind, Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the sky. His pupils reflected the figure descending from the sky. That figure was very familiar. The violent storm blew his clothes, but it could not shake his body in the slightest. However, for some reason, his body, which was as heavy and solid as a mountain, did not move an inch at this moment. In that moment of life and death, he still quietly raised his head and looked up, without the slightest movement. It seemed that he was caught unprepared. Or was he waiting for death? Or was he helpless? The storm was like a wild horse that had escaped its reins, wreaking havoc in the house. The murderous shadow hidden behind the fierce wind had not hesitated at all from the beginning. As soon as it rushed into the house, it immediately pounced on its target, using the fiercest killing move with the fiercest murderous intent. The storm that filled the sky seemed to have become its follower, whistling and converging into a fearsome and terrifying force. In the depths of the shadow, Lu Chen's face was faintly discernible. His whole body was like a sharp blade stabbing straight down. The black dagger that he once owned was now gone. It had been destroyed by Perfected Lord Tianlan. Now there was a strange black fire flashing on Lu Chen's body. Even his eyes seemed to be burning with two balls of fire. In the blink of an eye, the two men seemed to be very close to each other. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up, as if he had not reacted to the fatal attack that was falling from the sky and could split his head open. Lu Chen was majestic and boundless, but at that moment he finally saw the person below clearly. The bald man. The man who was looking up. Should he really continue with this attack? Would this strike be the only chance in his life to kill this damn Baldy? The darned Baldy was so powerful and terrifying that it was almost impossible for one to reach the soul formation Perfected Lord realm through hard work alone. What better opportunity could there be than this? In a one-on-one battle, he seemed to have the absolute upper hand. He saw perfected Lord Tianlan's face. It was so short that he didn't even have time to judge whether this person was at a loss or not. Or was it just a trap, a test? Once again, a fork in the road of life appeared in front of him. He had to make a choice. If he made the wrong choice, he would fall into the abyss and die without a burial. The wind howled, and that moment seemed to last for an eternity. Supreme Tianlan stared at the figure descending from the sky. Looking at the familiar face in the shadow behind the storm, he wondered if he would stab him with a fatal blow. He remembered that morning many years ago when the sun was very warm. He found the boy in the alley and took him away. That morning he held the boy's hand. Although the boy was usually fierce and cunning, he was very obedient that day. Maybe he had that special ability since he was young, or maybe life had taught him survival skills. If he had to die, was it also a reincarnation and karma to die in the hands of the child he had taught? Those secrets hidden in his heart would probably disappear forever. There was even a smile on his lips. He squinted his eyes and looked at the murderous figure in the air. Then he made eye contact with the man in the wind. At that moment he actually felt that time was very, very slow. Then he suddenly heard a muffled groan from the sky. The wind suddenly whistled mournfully, but the murderous intent in the storm suddenly dissipated. Then he clearly saw Lu Chen's face suddenly change from the condensed murderous intent to a hint of surprise, and then suddenly turned red. It was as if all the blood in his body had suddenly rushed to his face and head. His body fell rapidly from the air and suddenly twisted in an extremely twisted position. Then Lu Chen's whole body flew out. While he was still in midair, Lu Chen's body made a few deep cracking sounds, as if a few of his bones had been forcibly broken by a powerful force. Immediately after, his body suddenly arched, his head jerked back in midair, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. A moment later, with a boom, Lu Chen's body heavily smashed into the wall beside him. In an instant, the bricks of the wall cracked and dust flew everywhere. The house also trembled and made rustling sounds, looking like it was about to collapse. Perfected Lord Tianlan silently stood where he was, his eyes fixed on the figure struggling under the messy ruins. A light flickered in the depths of his eyes. After a moment, he slowly walked up to Lu Chen, who was lying on the ground and coughing violently with his hand on his chest. There was a painful expression on Lu Chen's face. Anyone who had a few bones broken and had their meridians devoured by an extremely fierce force would not feel good. If it were an ordinary person, he would probably have fainted by now. But Lu Chen did not. He panted heavily and finally calmed down a little. Then he raised his head and looked at perfected Lord Tianlan, who was standing silently in front of him. After a moment, a smile suddenly appeared on his bloody face. Then with a hint of mockery he scolded, "F***ck off, damn baldy." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at this young man and opened his mouth. It seemed that even someone as wise as him did not expect to hear such words at this time. For a moment he did not know what to say. But for some reason he was not angry. On the contrary, his gaze even softened a little. He squatted down his tall and burly body and approached Lu Chen. After a moment of silence, he looked at his face that was stained by blood and dust and said, "You must have wanted to scold me for a long time, right?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, since the day you threw me into the devil cult." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. He reached out and patted Lu Chen's shoulder. Then he casually lifted Lu Chen up and threw him on his back. Lu Chen let out a muffled groan as if he had hit a sore spot. His body trembled, but apart from this sound, he did not say a word and endured it. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not say anything else. Just like that, he carried Lu Chen and walked out of the room, leaving the ruins behind him. He did not even care about the White Lotus who was lying in the dust, dead or alive. Just like that, he left this place with his only disciple. A line of warm blood flowed down his lapel. He looked down and said, "Your blood is still warm?" Lu Chen leaned on his shoulder. His breath sounded weak and painful. After a while he said, "Of course." Chapter 633. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not hide his tracks when he left. It seemed as if nothing had happened as he walked calmly as if nothing had happened. Of course, he was carrying the pale and haggard-looking Lu Chen on his back. After he walked out of the door and took 5 or 6 steps forward, a sudden roar came from behind him. It sounded like a cry of despair or a sigh of frustration. Then there was a cracking sound. Dozens of cracks appeared on the brick walls of the house and spread rapidly. Then with a loud roar, the whole house collapsed. Dust and gravel flew into the air. It was a rather spectacular sight. However, perfected Lord Tianlan did not even turn back to look. He just walked calmly and slowly. Such a huge commotion naturally alerted the surroundings. Moreover, this was Fiyunji's territory. As the most vigilant and powerful hall in Zhangxianming, the people here moved the fastest. Not long after, many people rushed out of the surrounding houses. Some of them looked vigilant, some of them were disheveled. It was unknown what they were doing in the houses. Further away, more people were rushing over from all directions. The expressions of the people who were the fastest to arrive were the first to change, looking extremely shocked. They immediately stopped and stood to the side. Some of the more impatient ones who arrived later shouted angrily, "Who is so bold? How dare you?" When he saw the scene in front of him clearly, he choked on his words as if he had eaten a raw duck egg. He looked shocked and took a few steps back, looking as if he had seen a ghost. More and more people appeared in the surroundings and then quietly stood to the side to watch. At the same time, a strange emotion also spread in the crowd. None of the people here were fools. They only believed what they saw with their own eyes. Lu Qin, young Master Lu, was injured for some unknown reason. However, perfected Lord Tianlan did not care about bloodshed and personally carried this disciple. They were like father and son. The rumors that had been secretly spreading in the past disappeared at this moment. Their relationship seemed to be unbreakable and indestructible. If there was a need to choose a side, there was no longer any need to think about it. Everyone consciously kept a distance from perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin and looked at the master and disciple with complicated feelings. At the same time, many people secretly looked in another direction. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked forward. His body was tall and sturdy, but his steps were unusually steady. At the same time, Lu Qin suddenly heard his deep and sonorous voice. "I've destroyed that black sword. Now that I think about it, it's a pity." Lu Qin raised his head slightly and glanced at him without saying a word. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said in a low voice, "Perhaps he can really injure me." Lu Qin closed his eyes. Perfected Lord Tianlan was not offended. He thought for a moment and said, "How did you manage to make a sound on two walls at the same time when you were outside the house?" Just as Lu Qin was about to say something, the two of them suddenly sensed something and turned to look at the collapsed house together. They saw a stone being pushed away from the rubble. Then a black figure jumped out and stood on the spot, shaking with all its might. Immediately, a cloud of dust rose. It was Black Dog. Lu Qin did not say anything, but perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and nodded. "This dog is not bad." Lying on perfected Lord Tianlan's shoulder, Lu Qin walked through the crowd. Suddenly, he saw a familiar figure standing in the crowd not far away. The person was looking at him with surprise and a little doubt. Lu Qin hesitated for a moment. Then he waved at the fat man and said, "Old Ma, come here for a moment." In the crowd, Old Ma was startled. The people around him immediately dispersed, leaving him alone. Old Ma smiled awkwardly and had no choice but to walk forward. Apparently, perfected Lord Tianlan had no intention of stopping for Old Ma and continued to walk his own path. Even if Old Ma was 10 times more courageous, he would not dare to argue with perfected Lord Tianlan. Therefore he could only blindly follow behind perfected Lord Tianlan. Then he slightly bent down and approached Lu Qin. With a sad face and a little nervous he said, "My little ancestor, what are you doing?" Lu Qin coughed and pointed to the back. Then he said, "White Lotus is still in that house. She was buried under the rubble. Although I don't know whether she is dead or alive, you can go and have a look." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look back, but at this moment he slightly raised his eyebrows. Old Ma was stunned for a moment. No one knew what had happened in that house. However, when he peeked at perfected Lord Tianlan, he found that this big shot had no intention of saying anything. Old Ma could only grit his teeth and nodded to Lu Qin. "I see." Lu Qin hummed in acknowledgement. He seemed to still be a little worried, so he added, "If she's dead, we'll bury her. If she's still alive, we'll try our best to save her. After all, she's someone we know." Oh, Old Ma agreed. Then he turned back and strode toward the house. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked a few steps forward with Lu Qin on his back. Suddenly he said, "Just an acquaintance?" Lu Qin said, "That's it." "Okay." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded expressionlessly. Then he left with Lu Qin on his back. After the two protagonists left, the surrounding crowd gradually dispersed. Only Old Ma was left standing in front of the pile of collapsed houses, speechless for a moment. He stood there for a moment and looked around. However, he found that no one came over. It seemed that everyone was very smart and did not want to get involved in this matter, which was likely to cause trouble for them. Therefore he was the only one who was unlucky. Old Ma sighed and lowered his head to turn over the broken stones and bricks. Next to him, Atsu probably saw that Lu Qin was carried away by perfected Lord Tianlan. It stayed where it was and did not follow Lu Qin. It was probably because this dog had always been in awe of the bald perfected lord and was unwilling to approach him. However, even if it stayed where it was, Atsu obviously had no intention of helping old Ma. It took a few steps to the side, jumped on a stone and lay on it. Then it lazily watched old Ma work like a laborer. Although old Ma was fat, he was still a cultivator and had some cultivation. Therefore he worked much faster than ordinary people. Soon he turned over a lot of broken bricks and found White Lotus lying in a cloud of dust. Looking at White Lotus lying on the ground, covered with dust, old Ma was shocked and hurried to check her breath. After a while, a warm breath came from his fingertips. Old Ma heaved a sigh of relief. Then he stared at the girl whose beautiful face was mostly covered by dust, shook his head and said to himself, "You also have a hard life. In fact, it's very tiring to live, but who wants to die?" When he said the last sentence, his voice was very soft, as if he had been touched by something. Chapter 634. If Zhengxianming was the most powerful organization in the world and gathered the greatest power in the world, then the Immortal City and the Celestial Dragon Mountain were the biggest stage in the world. On this incomparably huge stage, for thousands of years, scenes of joys and sorrows of the human world, countless plots of power and intrigue had happened here. There were even more treacherous and strange things that happened in the dark places where the sun couldn't shine and were not known by most people. It was like a pagoda of slaughter stacked layer by layer. Everyone had their own position and height, and they could only know things at their level. However, there was one thing that everyone understood and knew. The higher they went, the higher they stood, the bigger the things they knew and the greater the benefits they could obtain. No one was willing to be ordinary. In the Immortal City, the world's largest Vanity Fair, the most realistic and most yearning tower of power, everyone desperately wanted to climb up. Mediocre people who had no desire to struggle, no perseverance, and no ambition had long been swept away here. In this huge city where everyone preached justice, fairness, and benevolence, there were actually not many people who really believed in these beautiful words. Lu Qin did not believe in these beautiful words. He came from the outside world that was a little dark and shadowy. In the beginning he always felt a little out of place with this bright city, but later on, everything changed for the better. One of the best things about Vanity Fairs in the world was that the people here would always look up to those who stood at the top and worship them, even if they knew that one day in the future, they might personally kill and rob those dazzling treasures that people coveted. However, as long as their strength was not enough, as long as their ambition was not big enough, they would be filled with fanatical worship for power. People take the preferences of those who stand at the top as their preferences. They look up to those in power. People imagine that their lives must be far beyond their imagination. In people's world, power is the only standard. Lu Qin was an outsider. In the beginning, many people did not like him. He seemed to be out of place in this huge city where fame and fortune ran amok. But perfected Lord Tianlan showed him what real power was, and made Lu Qin understand what kind of power he was facing. Unexpectedly, the bald true immortal decided to take Lu Qin as his personal disciple. He was the only one who had ever accepted Lu Qin as his disciple. Then, he solemnly held a grand and unprecedentedly grand apprenticeship ceremony. All the powerful people on Mount Celestial Dragon, who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world in the Immortal City, came to the scene to support this young man who became rich overnight. From a nameless shadow, a down-and-out man that no one cared about, he had become a hot young talent in the True Immortal Alliance in one go. He was a strong contender for the position of power in the True Immortal Alliance in the future. He held great power in his hands, and he could even faintly stand up to that woman from the Floating Clouds Agency. The charm of power could be seen from this. Lu Qin was a smart man, even smarter than many people. After getting this rare opportunity, he immediately grasped it tightly and began to change himself. He adapted to the rules of this huge city and learned all kinds of things in this Vanity Fair. He learned very quickly. Of course, this could be attributed to having a good teacher. Even though his feelings for the damn baldy True Monarch Tianlan had always been so complicated, it could never change the fact that True Monarch Tianlan was a man of great talent and strategy. Even Lu Qin had never wavered in his respect for True Monarch Tianlan's strength after so many years. What had wavered in his heart was actually the matter of trust. No one wanted to be perfected Lord Tianlan's enemy, including Lu Qin himself. After perfected Lord Tianlan took Lu Qin away from that room, the atmosphere on Sky Dragon Mountain seemed to be quiet, which lasted for quite a long time. This was actually quite rare for Zhengxianming, which had always been surging with undercurrents and fighting for power and profit. So much so that everyone secretly muttered in their hearts, "Could it be that there is a big conspiracy happening in some dark corner that I don't know about?" This was a matter of life and death. Not knowing what was going to happen in this huge Vanity Fair, it was simply a sin deserving of death. It might be the best opportunity to climb up, or it might once again remind those who were at a loss that their level was not high enough. Because he had a good master, Lu Chen's level was forcibly raised by a lot in a short period of time. This was an opportunity that countless people were extremely envious of. Correspondingly, he knew much more than ordinary people. Because there were some things that only perfected lords of Huashan Realm knew. And now, perfected lords of Huashan Realm were telling him secrets that could make people crazy. "I'm going to do something big," perfected Lord Tianlan said to Lu Chen when there were only the two of them in the main hall of Kunlun. His expression was solemn and resolute. At the same time he was gentle and kind to Lu Chen. It seemed that this time he had really made up his mind to completely trust this disciple and was going to share all his secrets with him. Lu Chen could clearly feel this mood of the damn Baldy, but he was not too surprised. Instead, he felt his heart was heavy and even a suffocating dizziness. What a big thing that a perfected lord of Huashan Realm, or even a perfected lord of Huashan Realm like the damn Baldy, who was arrogant and looked down on the world, would be talking about something big in such a serious manner. It would probably pierce through the sky. With a polite smile on his face, Lu Chen thought to himself. Then he heard what perfected Lord Tianlan said next, "I'm going to set up a trap to kill the other old farts in Zhengxianming." The smile on Lu Chen's face suddenly froze, and his mind went blank for a moment. Then, in the shortest time possible, he thought about which people in Zhengxianming were qualified to be called old farts by perfected Lord Tianlan, and how many of them were worthy of being carefully plotted against by the damn Baldy instead of directly crushing them with his insufferably arrogant strength. The final answer was surprisingly simple. It was so simple that Lu Chen's mouth became dry. Then from his heart to his mouth there was only one word left. "Lunatic? Are you crazy?" Lu Chen stared at the damn Baldy, took a deep breath and then said with some difficulty, "You want to kill that kind of people and several of them?" Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and replied with a Then he looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "What do you think? Am I very powerful?" Lu Chen looked up at the magnificent dome of the palace of Kunlun and let out a long breath. Then he struggled to persuade and said, "How about we take it slow and kill them one by one?" Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered and waved his hand, saying indifferently, "Too troublesome." Chapter 635. There was no way to reason with a lunatic. There was a sense of powerlessness in Lu Chen's heart, and he had a deeper understanding of this truth. But very quickly he discovered that he actually had a little bit of confidence in this madman's crazy plan, and he was even curious about what this crazy Baldy would do next. One is marked by the company one keeps. Will a person who gets close to a Baldy also go crazy? Lu Chen composed himself and scolded himself in his heart. Sitting next to him, Supreme Tianlan seemed to have thought of something and said to Lu Chen, "By the way, when you went to the Heavenly Law Hall to find the old man Tiehu and told him about the leaf, what was his reaction?" Lu Chen's originally drifting thoughts were pulled back by these words. He thought for a moment and recalled the situation at that time. He opened his mouth and said, "After true Lord Tiehu heard what I said, his expression was obviously shocked at that time. However, he quickly regained his composure and revealed a disdainful expression. He didn't say much to me and finally nodded his head and said that he understood." Supreme Tianlan thought for a while and nodded. "That's enough." Lu Chen didn't understand him and couldn't help asking, "What do you mean?" Supreme Tianlan waved his broad palm in front of him, and several of his fingers seemed to be unconsciously flexing and stretching. He glanced at Lu Chen with some complicated emotions in his eyes. It was neither anger nor joy but a little perplexity. Yes, emotions such as confusion and hesitation were very rare for a person like perfected Lord Tianlan, but he still revealed them at this moment. Lu Chen also noticed this and he was a little puzzled for a moment because this didn't seem like the person he knew. Or rather, Lu Chen himself had rarely seen such emotions from this damn Baldy in his past interactions with him. However, Supreme Tianlan didn't hesitate for long. He seemed to have made a decision very quickly. He looked at Lu Chen with a smile and began to explain to him. The moment Supreme Tianlan opened his mouth, Lu Chen suddenly understood something. This person could have ignored everyone in the world, but now he was willing to patiently explain his feelings to him. It seemed that he was really willing to treat himself as one of his own. There was no more estrangement or suspicion between them. To outsiders they were master and disciple who were as close as father and son, but in fact they could feel that there was still a distance between them, just like a river or a ditch between them. That ditch and the river were actually not wide and could be easily crossed. However, the two men always stood on his side and did not take the initiative to take the step. It was a very subtle and complicated emotion that involved so many years of ups and downs, and also related to the most basic bit of trust between them. Until this moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt that Supreme Tianlan seemed to have suddenly decided not to wait and was willing to take the initiative to accept him. What made him suddenly decide to give up all his worries and really trust him? Lu Chen thought of the blow he struck his head in Su Qingjuan's room. What Tai Hu said, at least he didn't deny that Yi is now in his hands, Supreme Tianlan said lightly. Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, it's enough to know this. In the future we'll think of a way to snatch that thing from him. Snatch something from the hands of a divine transformation realm perfected cultivator. Lu Chen smiled bitterly and tried to get used to this way of speaking. Then he frowned and asked, from what you said, it seems that the fragments of the divine tree of the devil cult are very important to you? Supreme Tianlan seemed to have suddenly established a firm trust in Lu Chen. He nodded and said, that's right. Although these items are evil, they are the only treasures in the world that possess the legendary power of the gods. They are of great use to me. Lu Chen looked a little solemn. It seemed that he felt complicated and uneasy about these few devil cult items. He raised his hand as if he wanted to touch something, but he quickly put it down when it was halfway to his chest. He frowned and said to Supreme Tianlan in a low voice, I don't know what you want to do, but these items belong to the devil cult after all. It may be okay to keep them secretly, but if you take them out and use them, I'm afraid there will be a lot of criticism. Supreme Tianlan looked calm and said, it's okay. Seeing his determined expression, Lu Chen didn't try to persuade him anymore. However, his expression was still solemn as if he was under a lot of pressure. After a while, he asked Perfected Lord Tianlan, 1 branch, 2 leaves and 1 seed. Do you need to get all 4 pieces of the divine tree? Supreme Tianlan hesitated for a moment before saying, that's not it. Of course, it's best to have all 4 for the greatest effect. However, if you have at least 2 leaves, it should be barely enough. He paused for a moment before adding, out of these 4 fragments, the seed has the strongest spiritual energy and is much stronger than the other 3, so if I only have 1 seed I will be able to use it. Otherwise I will need at least 2 leaves. Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he let out a breath of turbid air and said softly, but you only know that there's a leaf in the iron kettle now, right? No. Supreme Tianlan suddenly sneered and said with a solemn expression, I have a second one. Lu Chen's body shuddered and his expression changed starkly as he raised his head and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Atsu, who was in the courtyard, suddenly raised its head and looked in the direction of the top of Sky Dragon Mountain. It seemed to have sensed something at that moment and looked over with a hint of worry. But perhaps it was because the feeling was still fleeting, or perhaps it was because the distance was too far that even Atsu wasn't too sure. So after a while, Atsu quietly laid back on the ground again. This was the old house at the horse-washing bridge in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City. The house on the mountain collapsed and old Ma was entrusted by Lu Chen to look for White Lotus. He found the girl in the rubble and realized that she was still alive. The atmosphere on the mountain was a bit weird, and the identity of White Lotus became more and more awkward. It was obvious that Supreme Tianlan carried Lu Chen out of that house and then the house collapsed, but he did not care about White Lotus at all. This bald Supreme's attitude was very clear. If Lu Chen, who was on the back of Supreme Tianlan, had not told Old Ma in public, Old Ma suspected that he might not have been able to carry White Lotus down the mountain safely. But even so, Old Ma felt that there might be many eyes staring at them outside the house at this moment. Women are really troublesome. Old Ma looked at the beautiful girl lying on the bed in the house and sighed with emotion. Although he did not know whether this White Lotus had made a mistake or touched the bottom line of Supreme Tianlan, it should not be a secret that Supreme Tianlan did not like this person, or perhaps he would prefer her to be dead. Why couldn't Lu Chen understand this? Old Ma shook his head and was ready to leave. But just as he was about to leave, he suddenly glanced at White Lotus out of the corner of his eye and saw a faint green light suddenly flashing. Old Ma was stunned for a moment. He took a step forward and found a strange green twig-shaped chain around White Lotus' neck. He did not know when it had slipped out, but it seemed to be stimulated by something. The small twig was shining brightly as if something was coming back to life. Chapter 636. Old Ma suspiciously stared at the strange necklace exposed on White Lotus's fair skin. The faint green light flickered silently. The light was very gentle, not dazzling and did not seem to have any dangerous aura, instead it carried a faint vitality of life. But old Ma could still vaguely feel, in this branch-shaped thing, there seemed to be some fragility, or it should be said, a little like a person who was out of breath. Of course, exactly what was the specific situation, old Ma also did not dare to easily make a conclusion. After all, he had never seen this thing before, just that right now his expression seemed to have turned solemn after the initial shock. All these years, although old Ma's reputation was not prominent and he did not make any world-famous achievements, but in fact in these 10 or 20 long years, he had always stood together with Lu Qin at the forefront of the battle against the evil sect. Although what he did was the most inconspicuous and most secretive kind of work, but in fact his position was exceptionally important. If Lu Qin in that period of time was said to be the shadow who dived into the deep waters, fighting with the bloody shoals of fish in the dark shadows, then old Ma was the only tube that Lu Qin could breathe through from the suffocating water surface. And it was precisely because of this, with Lu Qin's unyielding and suspicious mind, despite the ups and downs over the years, old Ma to him was still the most trustworthy and most willing to get close to person. This was a friendship that had been honed in those despairing and painful years, experienced the test of life and death and blood. For shadows like them, trust was the most extravagant emotion. One must know Lu Qin even once suspected that tallest figure. To be able to gain Lu Qin's trust and survive for so many years in the underground dark world fighting against the evil sect, old Ma of course could not be a useless person, and even more could not be a person who knew nothing about the evil sect. On the contrary, his understanding of the evil faction was definitely one of the top few in the world. There was an old saying, the person who wanted to understand you the most must be your enemy. Based on old Ma's knowledge of the evil sect, when he saw the branch-shaped chain, a word suddenly flashed across his mind: divine tree. Yes, although the 4 divine weapons of the devil cult were secretive, people like them definitely knew about them. However, because of his different identity from Lu Qin, old Ma had actually never seen the 4 pieces of the so-called 1 branch, 2 leaves and 1 seed of the divine tree. Whether it was the legendary treasure or not, old Ma really did not dare to draw a conclusion. Furthermore, no matter what, White Lotus was the last disciple of a deity-stage true monarch of the Kunlun party. How could the devil cult's divine weapon be with her? This possibility was a little unimaginable, but old Ma still stared at the chain. After a moment, he slowly took a step forward and stood in front of the seemingly unconscious White Lotus. He seemed to be hesitant, but in the end he still stretched out his hand and gently touched the chain. There were too many things in this world that seemed impossible. Some were like the collapse of heaven and earth, some were like the vicissitudes of the world, and some were things that people firmly believed would not happen. For example, parents were always loving, even a vicious tiger would not eat its cubs, or lovers were always faithful, would not separate and would not betray, and there were also people who firmly believed that the person they trusted would not stab them in the back. Old Ma had lived for so many years and watched the dark world behind the light. Other than the collapse of heaven and earth and vicissitudes of the world, he had seen everything else. He knew that in this world there was nothing that was eternal and unchanging. Many times it was just a kind of fantasy and illusion that people were willing to believe in. At that moment, when his fingers were about to touch White Lotus's fair neck, his heart suddenly tightened as if he had sensed some kind of danger. But at the same time in his heart, a thought that he had thought of a long time ago flashed past. That year in that desolate valley, when Lu Qin betrayed those evil cult teachers and stabbed the black blade into their backs, those evil people probably also had this kind of absurd thought? Perhaps it was because these few years he had finally left the front line of the battle with the evil cult, this fatty who was once vigilant still had some slack. So much so that his state of mind at this moment suddenly became careless. He did not notice that in this close proximity, White Lotus, who was lying on the bed, suddenly clenched her fists. In his eyes, there was only that faint green light. In his mind, there was only the voice of the evil cult treasure echoing in amazement. Lu Qin was once a shadow. He had stayed in the world's most dangerous and treacherous evil cult for 10 years, he had seen many things, encountered countless dangers and unimaginable accidents, but in the end he had survived them all, until today. Therefore, right now he actually rarely had that kind of huge emotional fluctuation, because when he encountered an unexpected accident, he would often instinctively suppress his shock and quickly calm down, start to judge the direction of the situation and then decide what he should do next. This was a very important reason why he was able to live till today, because this kind of invisible ability was too hidden, so sometimes he even needed to show panic when he was not panicking. In a calm situation, make himself look very anxious as if he was about to lose control. Of course, he was also human. He also had weaknesses. Even someone as calm and cold as him, These few years there were also times when he lost control of his emotions. And every time he lost control of himself, someone would die in his hands. On this day in this Kunlun palace, Lu Qin revealed a shocked expression, but this time it was not an act, he was really shocked. He was so surprised that he even stood up and stared at Supreme Lord Tianlan. Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed not to care about Lu Chen's loss of composure, or perhaps he had already expected it. He did not say a word, only smiled and gently rotated his fingers. Both of their gazes landed on perfected Lord Tianlan's hand. His finger, which had been empty previously, now had a small object. It was a piece of green full of life. This was a leaf without branches to rely on. This was a leaf without a foundation. However, it was different from the leaves in the world that quickly withered after leaving the trunk and branches. This leaf was filled with the aura of life and spiritual power. The power was so abundant that it even gave people the feeling that this leaf was directly absorbing energy and spiritual power from the space around it. The emerald green light encircled the leaf, as if announcing its identity. Lu Qin did not need to think carefully to know the origin of this thing. There were only two such leaves in the world. They were both evil, legendary treasures of the evil devil cult, and this was one of the only two leaves left in this world by the Tree of God. Where did this come from? Lu Qin raised his head, looked at Supreme Lord Tianlan and asked word by word. Chapter 637. Lu Qin could be said to be one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about the four mysterious fragments of the Tree of God that had been passed down in the devil cult since ancient times. Among the four fragments, the seed was undoubtedly the most powerful and the most important one. In the Battle of the Desolate Valley, the three elders of the devil cult and the fire shaman of the barbarian tribe directly activated the spiritual power of the seed and activated the most powerful god-subduing spell formation of the devil cult since ancient times. It was almost a heaven-defying thing. Of course, in the end they failed at the last step. This was also the reason why the devil cult hated the shadow called Black Wolf and the initiator Fuyunji to the bone. They hunted them down and took revenge for many years. Although there were countless bloody stories in the process, it was undeniable that the Battle of the Desolate Valley had really hurt the foundation and vitality of the devil cult. In addition, there was a gathering of the righteous here. Zhang Xianming had many outstanding talents, and there was even Supreme Tianlan, a peerless figure with great talent and bold vision. In the end, the devil cult, a sect with a long history, was finally completely destroyed. In addition, Lu Qin actually knew the whereabouts of the four treasures that many people could not figure out. The most important seed of the four fragments of the Tree of God was hidden in his body. It merged with his body and became that strange and mysterious ancient tree-hole space. He had seen the branch of the Tree of God before. Strangely, it was on White Lotus. But when he entered the tree-hole of the Tree of God, Lu Qin clearly felt that the tree-hole formed by the seed seemed to have absorbed a large part of the spiritual power essence from the branch and changed the shape of the tree-hole. Because of this, he did not try to snatch the branch from White Lotus. Part of the reason was that the situation was very delicate at that time, but the main reason was that he felt that he did not need the branch. The last two leaves were unknown to him. Although he occasionally encountered some clues over the years, it was not until recently that he was sure that one of the leaves was actually in the hands of Supreme Tiehu of Zhang Xianming. As for the last leaf, he really did not know the whereabouts of it. He knew 3 of the 4 treasures and had the most important one or even 2. No one in the world knew this secret except for himself. He thought he had basically mastered this secret until he suddenly saw the leaf in Supreme Tianlan's hand. Sure enough, there were always unexpected things in this world, and this perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to always be able to do things that others couldn't. He was always giving people a shock or a surprise. Where did this come from? The first thought that popped into Lu Chen's mind was that this crazy baldy couldn't have suddenly run over to the Heavenly Law Hall last night, killed Tai Hu and then snatched his leaf, right? Without a doubt, this idea was completely unreasonable and filled with madness. It was a ridiculous fantasy, but Lu Chen soon discovered that he actually didn't dare to completely rule out this possibility. However, Lu Chen soon found that he did not dare to completely rule out this possibility. This kind of scalp-numbing thing happened to this damn baldy. He stared at Supreme Tianlan and clenched his teeth hard. Supreme Tianlan's expression looked much calmer and gentler. He even looked a little happy, as if he was very gratified by Lu Chen's shocked expression. He smiled and said to him, "How is it? You didn't expect me to have this treasure, did you? Did you get a shock?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and nodded heavily. "Yes, I was almost scared to death." Supreme Tianlan laughed and suddenly flicked his finger. The leaf flew into the air and then floated lightly toward Lu Chen. Lu Chen's heart suddenly jumped and his body tensed up almost subconsciously. His eyes were fixed on the leaf. He could even feel a sudden violent vibration in a certain part of his body. To be honest, at this moment Lu Chen was really afraid. He was afraid that the seed hidden in his heart would sense this leaf and then do something that he could not control. After all, for so many years, Lu Chen had almost no control over the tree hole formed by the seed other than himself, who could enter and exit the mysterious tree hole, even if he had used up all the immortal water that was once filled with life's spiritual energy. Fortunately, it was unknown whether the seed had a mind of its own, or it did not have a particularly big reaction. After the initial commotion, it quickly quieted down. Even when Lu Chen reached out to take the leaf, the seed did not move at all. Lu Chen heaved a sigh of relief inwardly. He felt that even if he had a tough heart, this kind of repeated torture and fright was a little too much for him to bear. It was probably going to shorten his life. When he held the leaf in his palm, he felt a vaguely familiar feeling. It was the unique aura of abundant life spiritual energy, which he felt when he immersed himself in the immortal water in the tree hole. Based on this feeling alone, Lu Chen could determine that this leaf was real. The damn Baldy had actually gotten his hands on a leaf of the tree of God. He raised his head and looked at the damn Baldy. Although he did not speak this time, the puzzled look in his eyes had already revealed his meaning. At the same time, there was a more complicated meaning. He did not speak, but perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be able to read his mind. He chuckled and folded his arms in front of his abdomen, saying, "Don't guess blindly. Although the old man Tai Hu is unbearable, he is after all a perfected lord of the divine transformation realm for many years. How can he be so easy to kill? This leaf is not the one in his hand." Lu Chen nodded silently. In his heart he thought, as expected. This world is still considered normal, although it seems to be almost full of lunatics. He calculated in his heart, and his eyes fell on the leaf again. He thought, is this the fourth and last fragment of the tree of God that has been missing for a long time? He held the leaf lightly, then returned it to perfected Lord Tianlan without changing his expression. He said, "If it is not perfected Lord Tai Hu's, then this is." His voice suddenly paused as if he suddenly thought of something. In his memory, the damn Baldy did not have any fragments of the tree of God. Moreover, he knew the whereabouts of the other 3 fragments and could not have been taken away by him. In other words, the damn Baldy most likely obtained this leaf recently. What happened recently? What could possibly be related to this divine weapon fragment? The answer was almost obvious. Lu Chen closed his eyes slightly. He felt that his throat was a little dry, and a strange and complicated expression appeared on his face. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a smile and a deep gaze. He said, "Have you figured it out?" Lu Chen sighed and said, "I didn't expect it to be with him. I should have thought of it long ago. Apart from him there is no one else." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. He walked over and patted Lu Chen's shoulder. He said with a smile, "This is all thanks to you. It can be said that it did not take me any effort to get it. With this, as long as I find the other fragment, there is no need to worry about failure. Heaven is helping me." Chapter 638. It was the leaf carried by Elder Ghost. To be honest, although this answer was a little abrupt, it was not too surprising after thinking about it carefully. As the last leader of the devil cult who had the power to rally people, Elder Ghost undoubtedly controlled the last resources of the devil cult, including those unspeakable secrets. The shards of the tree of God to the evil sect was the most sacred holy object, just that after thousands of years of changes in the world, the 4 shards had also scattered. Lu Chen knew that 3 of the shards' exact whereabouts were no longer in the hands of the evil sect people, then the last leaf was still in the evil sect, still hidden in Elder Ghost's hands. It was actually a very logical thing. However, it seemed to have benefited perfected Lord Tianlan. He followed Lu Chen to the underground city and met Elder Ghost. He killed this old rival who had been fighting with him for decades and took a piece of leaf. Even Lu Chen could not help but marvel at the luck of this damn Baldy. He muttered in his heart, "Is this the luck of the current number 1? It was originally extremely difficult to kill Elder Ghost and find that piece of leaf. In the end, perfected Lord Tianlan only followed him to the underground city and settled everything in one go. If it was not for the fact that Lu Chen knew that he was the one who first encountered those strange things in the underground city and that he was the one who brought perfected Lord Tianlan down, he would really suspect whether all of this was a conspiracy planned by perfected Lord Tianlan himself. Even when perfected Lord Tianlan sent him back to the surface, it was also his intention to kill and rob. In any case, everything was in the past now, and it was a foregone conclusion. Lucian had nothing more to say. In any case, at least for now, this person before him was truly unparalleled in the world, unstoppable, and even the heavens were on his side. Although this guy was a lunatic, but a lunatic who was lucky and capable, Lucian felt a little pain in his teeth again. Now we just have to wait for the last Blood Sea anomaly to appear in the sky. When that time comes, it will be the moment when the Blood Moon's aura reaches its peak and also the time when our plan starts to be implemented. It seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan had complete trust in Lucian, even though Lucian himself was surprised by this kind of treatment. However, he had never been able to figure out what perfected Lord Tianlan was thinking, so he could only let nature take its course. But to be honest, who in the world could really see through perfected Lord Tianlan? Blood Moon? The last time the Blood Sea phenomenon will appear? Although Lucian had not heard the complete so-called plan from perfected Lord Tianlan, he still quickly and keenly grasped a few key points in the damn Baldy's words. Just as he was about to ask in detail, perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly frowned as if he had thought of something. He muttered to himself, that's not right. Lucian was stunned for a moment. He saw perfected Lord Tianlan's hesitation and vigilance at this moment, which was rare for him. He would not act like this unless there was a major event. Lucian could not help but ask, "What's wrong?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. His gaze was deep as he said slowly, "I thought of something. Some time ago, I once asked perfected Lord Guyu of Starry Hall to divine the whereabouts of the 4 pieces of the divine tree of the devil cult. He also performed his divination very carefully and finally told me that there is only 1 piece in this immortal city. The whereabouts of the other 3 pieces are unknown." Lucian's heart shook, but he still maintained his composure on the surface. After a moment he asked softly, "When exactly did he do the divination? Could it be that someone else brought the fragment to the immortal city after he did the divination?" Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head slowly. The glimmer in the depths of his eyes was dim and difficult to understand. He said, "Now it seems that from the beginning, there were at least 2 of the 4 pieces of leaves in this immortal city. Elder Tai who has one, Elder Gue has another. There are also branches and seeds. It's hard to say if we don't know about it now, but he should have lied to me." Did perfected Lord Guyu lie to perfected Lord Tianlan? Why did he lie? This was a simple question, but the hidden matter was very big. The impact might be even bigger. Lucian didn't dare to say more. But now he actually didn't care about perfected Lord Guyu's intentions. Because he suddenly thought of another thing. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be determined to get these pieces of the devil cult's divine weapon. But other than the 2 pieces of leaves, the remaining 2 pieces, namely the branches and seeds, were also in this immortal city. The seeds were right in front of him on Lucian's body. The branches were at White Lotus's side. Everything was actually under his nose. If this secret was discovered by perfected Lord Tianlan, Lucian suddenly felt that not only did he have a toothache, but even his breathing started to become a little difficult. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression looked a little solemn. He walked back and forth in the hall with his hands behind his back. After a while, he turned his head and said to Lucian, "This matter has a great impact. We can't treat it lightly. I still have to go and deal with it." With that, he turned and walked out of the hall. Lucian subconsciously wanted to say something to him, but he quickly held back. There were some things that couldn't be explained. Even if it was the truth, if others didn't believe it, everything would be as good as nothing and the truth would become false. Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure quickly disappeared outside the hall. Lucian slowly walked out. When the sunlight shone on him, he slightly narrowed his eyes and looked up at the sky. The world was bright and the sky was high and wide. There was not a bit of hostility or any trace of the Blood Sea. Looking at the sky in front of him, it was simply impossible to imagine that it would be covered by the strange Blood Sea phenomenon. When the Blood Sea phenomenon appeared again, something would definitely happen, right? Lucian didn't have the intention to ask perfected Lord Tianlan immediately. At least from the looks of it, perfected Lord Tianlan would tell him sooner or later. But now he had a more important and urgent matter in front of him. Lucian calmed his mind and then strode in the direction of the mountain. Earlier, Old Ma had sent someone to tell him that White Lotus was indeed still alive and that he had dug her out from the ruins of that house. Because of the subtle atmosphere on Sky Dragon Mountain, it was indeed not suitable for White Lotus to continue staying on the mountain. Otherwise, who knew whether some greedy guy would run out and kill this girl and then ask for credit from perfected Lord Tianlan? Old Ma brought White Lotus to the house next to the horse-washing bridge at the foot of the mountain. Lucian decided to go and see her as soon as possible. Of course, this was just an excuse. In his heart, an originally unimportant matter had now become an urgent matter. The branch necklace still hanging on White Lotus's neck suddenly became a very troublesome thing. If the damn Baldy found this thing and came back to ask Luchin why he didn't tell him, it would be hard for Luchin to explain. Even if he didn't admit that he had seen it, would White Lotus stab him in the back and tell the damn Baldy that she had seen this branch before? Luchin felt that it was hard for the damn Baldy not to be suspicious given how much importance he attached to the fragment of the devil cult's sacred tree. What he didn't want to lose now was the damn Baldy's trust in him. He had a vague feeling that in the upcoming upheaval, perhaps the damn Baldy's trust was his biggest reliance. But when he walked quickly down the mountain he was still a little upset. It was really not easy to deal with White Lotus. That girl seemed to never be really controlled by anyone. How could he make her completely, reliably and truly shut up? Dead people? As Luchin walked in silence, this thought flashed through his mind. Then he was shocked, but then he found that his heart was actually calm. For him, perhaps life and death had long been a numb, cold and hard thing. He seemed to have really lost the feelings that should have been warm. Chapter 639. In the house next to the horse-washing bridge, Old Ma looked a bit restless. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in the bedroom, and on the bed White Lotus was still lying there with her eyes closed. Close by, the green chain on her neck was still shining. The house was very quiet, the door was unlatched and the window was half open. From there he could see the scenery of the courtyard. From where Old Ma was sitting, he could see the black dog lying under the big tree in the courtyard. It had a lazy and bored look, and its eyes were slightly closed as if it was going to fall asleep soon. Old Ma felt a bit nervous. He thought that it was mostly because of the importance of the tree branch. As for other things, it was quiet here, there was nothing worth being vigilant about. As for White Lotus, he subconsciously looked down. The beautiful young girl looked like a flower that was about to wither. His hand that was reaching for the branch paused slightly in midair. Finally he clenched his teeth and touched it. His somewhat stubby fingers reached into the soft green light, causing his body to slightly tremble. But after pausing for a moment, nothing unexpected happened. Old Ma looked at White Lotus, frowned, and then used his fingers to lightly grab the branch. When he touched the skin, he felt a cool water-like chill pass through his fingertips. It wasn't a very stimulating kind of cold, just a feeling that was a bit colder than the temperature of water. Even so, wearing this kind of necklace would definitely not be comfortable, unless one had an innate cold resistance, or if one's cultivation was too high and long ago ignored this little bit of cold. Old Ma used his fingers to gently stroke the lifelike branch a few times. After a moment of silence, his eyes flashed and he looked down again. White Lotus was still lying there motionless like before, as if she was no longer a threat to him. Everything here was decided by him alone. The light in the depths of his eyes suddenly flourished, as if he had made up his mind. His body slightly leaned forward, and just as he was about to do something, woof! Suddenly, a cry fiercely broke the silence in the bedroom. Even though it didn't sound loud, but in this silence, it was like a sudden clap of thunder, a clap of thunder in the clear sky. Old Ma's body violently trembled and he staggered, almost falling down. If he hadn't instinctively stretched out his hand to support himself on the bed, he would have been so scared that he would have directly thrown himself onto White Lotus's body. Even so, his unintentional forward movement almost touched White Lotus's body. His face was only a little distance away from White Lotus's face. This really made Old Ma's heart almost jump out of his chest. But luckily, White Lotus still didn't seem to have any signs of waking up, or else the situation would be really too embarrassing. A delicate fragrance from the young girl drifted into Old Horse's nose. It was like an orchid deep in the mountains. Although it was quiet and plain, its fragrance was distant and could stir one's heart. For a moment, Old Ma's gaze actually froze for a moment. He had never looked at a girl at such a close distance, not to mention White Lotus, who was so beautiful that she was even qualified to be the first in a 1,000-year-old family like the Kunlun party. She was supposed to be a high and unattainable woman like a snow lotus, but suddenly, it was as if she was right under his body and close at hand. Old Ma was a little dazed and his mind suddenly became a little chaotic and blank. He actually forgot what he wanted to do before, and even forgot why the current situation had become like this. But fortunately, although his mind was temporarily confused, there was a dog in the room whose mind was 10 times clearer than his. The black dog, who was not the slightest bit affected by the temptation of beauty, saw Old Ma's inexplicable loss of self-control. After the initial surprise and doubt, it quickly ran over, stood beside the bed and loudly barked into Old Ma's ear. Old Ma's body trembled and he cried out in alarm. This time he was quite frightened but not entirely out of fear. There was also an inexplicable sense of shame. His body slanted a little and he jumped up. He took 2 steps back and then looked at Atsu angrily and said, "You stupid dog, what are you doing? You stupid dog, what are you doing?" Atsu glanced at Old Ma and did not say anything, but the way it looked at Old Ma looked a little strange. Old Horse was not Lu Qin. He did not know the dog as well as Lu Qin did. He could completely understand what the dog meant without saying a word. Therefore, after mumbling a few words, Old Horse still walked over. But this time he did not dare to do anything more. After a moment of silence he said to Atsu, "I have a use for that chain." Atsu looked at him, not knowing if it was difficult to determine what he was thinking, but in the end it still stepped back. Old Ma secretly breathed a sigh of relief in his heart, and then walked to White Lotus. After calming down this time without hesitation, he reached out and directly grabbed the chain on White Lotus's neck. Then with a low groan, he exerted force in his hand and with a snap, the chain broke. He pulled the branch necklace off White Lotus's neck. When Lu Qin walked to the house at Shima Qiao, he heard Atsu's call from the door. It seemed that they were really here. Lu Qin's heart was relieved. Walking all the way from the door to the backyard, Lu Qin immediately saw Old Ma coming out from the bedroom, and at the same time Atsu followed behind him. Lu Qin walked over and shouted, "Old Ma, how is White Lotus?" At first, Old Ma seemed to be preoccupied and lost in thought. He didn't even notice Lu Qin's figure appearing on the other side of the yard. Until Lu Qin came over and shouted, Old Ma was suddenly startled. His body shook and he looked up to see Lu Qin. His face showed a bit of shock and a slightly panicked expression. Why did you come so quickly?" "Quickly?" Lu Qin asked with a little doubt and said, "It's okay. How is White Lotus?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment, turned around and pointed to the bedroom and said, "She hasn't woken up yet, she is lying on the bed." Lu Qin nodded, walked over and patted Old Ma's shoulder and said casually, "I will go in and see her. This time, thanks to you for saving her life. When she wakes up you have to ask her to repay you." Old Ma was startled and said, "Repay what?" Lu Qin looked at him strangely and said, "Anything, you can say whatever you want to say. Also, you won't really say anything excessive to her, will you?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "No." Lu Qin laughed and walked into the bedroom. Behind him, Old Ma looked at his back with a complicated expression, while the black dog stood at the side, looking at Old Ma and then at Lu Qin, not saying a word. No one knew what the dog was thinking. Lu Qin walked into the room and immediately saw White Lotus. Then he thought of the troubles he had worried about before, and then his eyes moved down slightly, looking at White Lotus's neck. Chapter 640. Since you're here, I'll go out for a walk and get some fresh air. Standing behind Lu Qin, Old Ma yawned, looking a little tired, and said, "I've been locked up here for half a day, it's a little stuffy." Lu Qin sat on the edge of the bed with his back facing him, looking at White Lotus, as if he was carefully observing her expression. After a moment of silence he didn't turn around and said in a very flat tone, "Okay." Old Ma turned around and walked out. Just when he walked to the door and was about to step out, with his back facing Lu Qin, a strange and complicated expression finally appeared on his face. Suddenly he heard Lu Qin suddenly call out from behind him, "Old Ma." Old Ma's heart skipped a beat, and his feet slowly landed on the ground, raising some dust and making a low sound. "What's wrong?" He smiled and turned around, asking Lu Qin's back. Lu Qin still didn't look back at him, still staring at the unconscious White Lotus lying on the bed, as if all his attention was still on the girl. At the same time he said to Old Ma in a very flat and casual tone, "When you come back later, bring some good wine and dishes. We haven't had a drink together for a long time." Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief, a smile appeared on his face and he scolded with a smile, "What are you talking about? We haven't had a drink because you've made a meteoric rise, haven't you? It's a small matter, leave it to me." After saying that, he seemed to feel a little funny, laughed twice and strode out. The room was quiet again and no one knew when Atsu disappeared from this room, and no one knew where he went in the blink of an eye. In such a big house, it gradually gave people a feeling of emptiness, as if in such a big place, only this bedroom had a little vitality left. The anger came from the two people in the room, Lu Qin and White Lotus, who looked like a dead person but was still alive. Lu Qin quietly stared at White Lotus. His eyes looked very calm and there was almost no strange expression on his face. His whole person seemed very calm and collected. Most of the time, his gaze landed on by Lien's fair neck in a strange manner. Even though there were times when he would shift his gaze away to look at other parts of her body in order to check on her injuries, he would quickly turn his gaze back to her. To be honest, it wasn't very polite for a man to stare at a girl's neck like this. If White Lotus was still awake, she would probably get angry. However, she was the one who was unconscious. Perhaps she didn't feel anything from the outside world, so she naturally didn't have any reaction. Lu Chen's gaze gradually became a bit deep and complicated. In this silence, he seemed to be thinking or judging something in his mind, and the expression on his face didn't look too good. After a moment, suddenly Lu Chen stretched out his hand, and this time directly placed it on the side of White Lotus's neck. He carefully touched the edge of her clothes a few times. This action of course was a bit excessive, and even crossed the line. In the midst of this, Lu Chen's fingers even directly touched the soft skin of White Lotus. At the edge of her clothes and even near her collarbone, he continuously pressed a few times, as if he was finally confirming something. After a while, he slowly straightened his body and expressionlessly stood up. He had already obtained his answer. The tree branch necklace that White Lotus used to wear was now gone, and on the originally white soft and even perfect skin, there was a small inconspicuous spot on the side and back of an inconspicuous place. There was a small inconspicuous faint red. It was like the blush that a girl's cheeks would have when she was shy, or as if she had just been lightly shaved. Lu Chen stood by the bed for a while, slightly frowning as he pondered. His hand hung by his side, calm and harmless. From this place, it wasn't very far from White Lotus who was lying on the bed. He only needed to bend down slightly, and this hand could once again return to the girl's neck. The beautiful girl slept quietly, as if she didn't know that there was such a hand beside her that could snap her neck at any time. The room was abnormally quiet, and one could even vaguely hear a strange sound in the extreme silence. It sounded like a person's heartbeat, but when one listened carefully, the sound disappeared as if it was just an illusion. Lu Chen stood there for a long time. At some point, he suddenly sighed softly, shook his head, and left the bedside. He walked to the door and looked out. Looking at the empty courtyard, he suddenly whistled loudly. The whistle broke the somewhat strange and uncomfortable silence, like a blade piercing a piece of white paper. After a while, a sudden bark rang out. From another corner of the room, the black dog scuttled out and trotted all the way back to Lu Chen's side. Lu Chen smiled. He didn't mind the dirt and sat directly on the doorsill. Then he hugged Atsu's head and stroked it hard. His eyes flickered as he said, "Stay here with me and wait for old Ma to come back." Atsu looked at him, and then obediently lay on the ground beside him. Lu Chen didn't say anything else. He just sat there and waited patiently. Time passed slowly. The light and shadow in the sky flickered, and the reflection in the room was also constantly changing. In the light and shadow, Lu Chen's face remained motionless like a statue, as if he had hidden all his emotions. Old Ma still didn't come back. When the sky gradually darkened and night finally fell, the house fell into darkness in the silence. Even Lu Chen's figure was swallowed by the surging darkness, but old Ma still didn't come back. Lu Chen had been sitting on the doorsill for a long time. He seemed to be particularly patient today, or perhaps there was an unusual desire in his heart that allowed him to sit there and wait for his friend. The food and wine he promised, the drinks he promised, had yet to come true. The sky was dark, and Atsu had already fallen asleep. There was some snoring as if it was laughing at Lu Chen's ridiculous persistence. Lu Chen looked up at the quiet night sky and for a moment he was also in a trance. He took one last look at the quiet courtyard, stood up silently and walked back to the bedroom. Bang! He slammed the door. Atsu was still sleeping and seemed to turn a deaf ear to this sound. Pada! Lu Chen lit a candle in the room and then walked to White Lotus, who had not woken up until now. He picked up one of her hands and checked it. He found that her pulse was stable, and the injuries on her body seemed to be improving. It seemed that her life was not in danger. What was strange was that the culprit that had been raging in her body, the tyrannical spiritual power, seemed to have been completely cleansed. Although the power of the spiritual power had been greatly weakened, it had completely calmed down and hid quietly in the sea of qi in White Lotus's dantian. It seemed that as long as it was given time, it would even show signs of merging with White Lotus's own spiritual power. This was the effect of the blood food secret method. Lu Chen was well aware of this. He glanced at White Lotus and smiled slightly, but the smile was slightly sarcastic. "I don't know if you heard what the damn Baldy said." He said, "You dare to eat such a deadly thing?" Chapter 641. The candlelight burned silently, lighting up the only source of light in the darkness, shining on the two of them. Lu Qin stared at White Lotus, his expression gradually becoming complicated and emotional. Then he casually sat down next to White Lotus and said to himself, "When you wake up, what will you do? The world is big but there is no place to stand and you don't want to die. This is probably torture." White Lotus lay motionless and didn't respond to his words. Lu Qin also didn't seem to care. He glanced at White Lotus's neck and then said in a low voice, "Is he the one who took that branch?" The dim candlelight fell on White Lotus's beautiful face and the room fell into silence. After a while, Lu Qin quietly pulled the quilt on White Lotus's body higher and covered her neck. Then he turned and walked out of the room. Lu Qin left the house next to the horse-washing bridge and took Atsu with him when he left. In other words, he left the unconscious White Lotus alone in this dark and uninhabited house. If someone came near, White Lotus would have no way to resist. This method was obviously not very appropriate, but Lu Qin did it. Moreover, when he left, he didn't have the slightest hesitation, as if he wasn't worried about the person in the house behind him. Taking advantage of the darkness of the night, he walked through the long street and the mountain path, returning to Mount Celestial Dragon. Then he walked all the way to the Fuyun Agency's territory. After glancing at the deep darkness of the night, he calmly walked into the Kunlun Palace where true Lord Tianlan was. In the dead of night, even though it wouldn't matter if Supreme Tianlan sat here for a few days and nights with his cultivation, he naturally wouldn't stay here under normal circumstances. In fact, the security outside the Kunlun Hall was also very tight. Only Lu Qin, with his unique identity, could come and disturb Supreme Tianlan at this time. He entered the hall and at the same time, a message was quickly sent. Lu Qin didn't know and didn't want to know what the damned Baldy was doing at this moment. He only said one simple thing in the message: "There's an urgent matter, come out and talk." When the boy who went in to report left, he looked at Lu Qin with a complicated expression. "You seem to be crying." Even a deity transformation stage supreme wouldn't be in a good mood to be disturbed in the middle of the night. No, it should be said that if a deity transformation stage supreme was angry, that would be even more frightening. Unfortunately, Lu Qin did not respond to his pleading eyes. After entering the hall, he simply sat down on a chair, obviously waiting for perfected Lord Tianlan to come out and speak. The boy sighed deeply and left with a hidden bitterness in his eyes. After a while, the boy ran out of the back hall with an excited expression, as if he had just escaped from death. He smiled and said to Lu Qin, "Young master, Supreme Tianlan will be here soon. He asked you to wait here for a while." Lu Qin nodded and said very politely, "Okay, thank you." The boy grunted and said, "There's no need to be so polite. I just want to trouble young master. We can do anything in the future, but please try not to come here so late at night." As he spoke, he looked at Lu Qin pitifully. Lu Qin felt a little embarrassed under his gaze. He smiled and nodded, saying, "Just this once." The boy went away happily. Not long after, the sound of footsteps was heard. It was Supreme Tianlan coming out of the back hall. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't look angry at all, as if it was no different from daytime to him. He even smiled at Lu Qin and asked, "What's the matter? Why are you in such a hurry?" Lu Qin had already stood up when he saw him. Without any hesitation, he said straightforwardly, "I may know the whereabouts of the branch of the Devil Sect's divine tree." Supreme Tianlan was startled, as if he didn't expect to hear this news from Lu Qin. He looked at him with interest and said, "You actually know this news? Then tell me." With that, he sat down on a chair next to him and beckoned Lu Qin to sit next to him. Lu Qin didn't intend to sit down. Instead, he stood and began to narrate the matter in the most direct and simple words. In the end, he said, "I guess that the thing on White Lotus's neck should be that branch. I went there today to make a final confirmation, but the branch disappeared when I reached Horse-Washing Bridge." Supreme Tianlan's expression didn't change. His eyes were deep. After pondering for a moment, he said, "So you suspect that old Ma took that branch?" Lu Qin said, "There's no one else but him." Most of the people in the world didn't know much about the devil cult, and they had never heard of the highest secret of the devil cult like the fragment of the divine tree. However, old Ma was the same as me. He knew everything about the devil cult. He can recognize that thing, and he didn't return for a whole night probably because he was confused by that branch. That's why he ran away in the night. Supreme Tianlan nodded slowly and said after a while, "Since you said so, I naturally believe in your judgment. What's your plan now?" Lu Qin said, "My plan is to find you now and tell you about the matter. You decide how to deal with it." Supreme Tianlan looked at him deeply, a light flashing in the depths of his eyes. After a while he stood up and walked to the door of the hall. He said indifferently to someone outside, "Call Shuang over right now." Someone outside immediately agreed. Then there was the sound of disorderly footsteps and someone hurriedly left. Supreme Tianlan looked up at the night sky with his hands behind his back. After a long time he turned around and slowly walked back to Lu Qin. He said, "Aren't you and Ma Xiaoyan best friends for many years? Why did you do this today?" Lu Qin looked up at him and answered without asking, "Do you think I did something wrong?" Supreme Tianlan thought for a while and said, "No, you did the right thing. You seem to say it sincerely. If it were me I would probably do the same." After saying that, he sighed with a faint disappointment on his face. It was unknown whether it was for himself or for Lu Qin. Some things couldn't be hidden. White Lotus wasn't dead yet. As long as she woke up, this matter would definitely be exposed. As long as she made a big deal of this matter, Supreme Tianlan might realize that Lu Qin might have seen this necklace a long time ago but didn't tell him. When old Ma left the bedroom, Lu Qin didn't look back at him, but he called out to him. At that time, did Lu Qin want old Ma to stay, or did he want him to take the branch and run away? Lu Qin didn't think about this question at all and didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to know the answer. He only knew that old Ma had left him for that very important evil cult treasure. Knowing this should be enough, right? As he thought this, he seemed to feel something at the same time. He looked back and saw Shuang walking in from the door of the hall. But she wasn't alone. What was rare was that there was another person following behind her. This was rare when she came to Supreme Tianlan's place. But soon the eyes of everyone in the hall lit up and stared at the face of the person behind Shuang. He was a little fat and looked a little familiar. He walked honestly and didn't raise his head. But Supreme Tianlan and Lu Qin immediately recognized that this person was old Ma. Chapter 642. Seeing the two people who had just entered slowly walk over with steady footsteps, the great hall of Kunlun was silent for a moment. Lu Qin looked at old Ma, while True Lord Tianlan turned his head to look at Lu Qin. Lu Qin could feel True Lord Tianlan's gaze on him. He didn't even need to look at the damn Baldy's eyes to feel the astonishment, surprise, and even a bit of mockery in his eyes. He knew what this damn Baldy was thinking. He knew that right now, True Lord Tianlan wanted to preserve some dignity for himself, as well as maintain some dignity in front of Shuang and the others. That was why he wasn't laughing to his heart's content. Although it was soundless, he seemed to be able to hear that laughter. The most inexplicable thing was that Lu Qin actually guessed that this damn Baldy probably knew that Lu Qin could understand his thoughts, so he was pretending to laugh in his heart. This was an inexplicable intuition that didn't make any sense. However, when Lu Qin silently turned his head to look at True Lord Tianlan, and saw this damn Baldy's unprecedentedly serious expression as well as the light that constantly flickered in his eyes, Lu Qin knew that his guess was probably correct. This feeling of telepathy was really embarrassing to the point of wanting to die. Shuang brought old Ma to the front. True Lord Tianlan's sleeves moved slightly as he looked at the two of them. Shuang stepped forward to greet them and old Ma knelt down as well. True Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change, as if he had suddenly forgotten that he had called Shuang over for an urgent matter. He only nodded lightly and said, "You've come." Shuang solemnly bowed to True Lord Tianlan, then stood up and said with a respectful expression, "My lord, I have a guess as to why you summoned me here in the middle of the night. However, before you speak, I also have an urgent matter to report." True Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "No problem, you go first." Shuang stepped to the side, revealing old Ma's figure. She then said, "Fiyunji's former Shadow Patrol Inspector Ma Xiaoyan has something to report to you." Both True Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin could tell that Shuang had deliberately emphasized the first 5 words in her simple words. She was probably emphasizing her identity. Supreme Lord Tianlan couldn't help glancing at Lu Qin out of the corner of his eye. Lu Qin stood aside expressionlessly, looking as unresponsive as a wooden man. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flickered with a faint smile. "Go ahead." Without saying a word, old Ma took 2 steps forward on his knees. Suddenly he reached into his bosom and took out a box. He presented it to Supreme Lord Tianlan with both hands and said loudly, "My lord, by chance, I have recently obtained one of the 4 fragments of the Devil Sect's legendary Tree of God, the Tree of God's branch. I dare not covet such a precious treasure, so I have specially come to offer it to you." His words were resolute and full of vigor, showing his loyalty. Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed to be moved. He nodded and said, "There's such a thing?" Old Ma said, "Yes, the treasure is in this box. Please have a look, my lord." Supreme Lord Tianlan casually waved his hand and the box in Old Ma's hand flew into his. After weighing it in his hand, Supreme Lord Tianlan opened the lid. At that moment, a green light shone out from the box. It flowed and swayed, carrying a strange aura of life. It was a spiritual power that almost no living creature in the world could possess. Legend had it that only the 4 fragments of the devil sect possessed it. It was the aura of the Tree of God. Lu Qin recognized that it was the real Tree of God's branch, and so did Supreme Lord Tianlan. At that moment, even with his calmness, he couldn't help but smile happily. He nodded and said, "Good, good, good. Little Ma, you have made a great contribution." Old Ma kowtowed and then stood up silently. He walked to Shui Ying and stood behind her. He lowered his head and lowered his arms, staring at the ground. Lu Qin looked at his old friend with a complicated expression. After a while he sighed softly. Seeing Supreme Lord Tianlan smiling and playing with the Tree of God necklace in his hand, Shui Ying also walked forward and said with a smile, "My lord, are you satisfied with this treasure?" Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Very good." Shui Ying smiled and pointed at Old Ma. She said, "Please tell me, how should I reward this person?" Supreme Lord Tianlan chuckled. His eyes flickered as he glanced at Lu Qin. His expression didn't change as he said generously, "This item is of great use to me. Little Ma, you have done well and made a great contribution. How about this, from today onwards, Ma Xiaoyun will be promoted to Deputy Hall Master of Fuyunji. He will assist Shui Ying in managing the affairs of the shadow. This can be considered his old profession." Shui Ying was slightly startled. She then smiled and nodded in agreement. Old Ma had already knelt down to express his thanks. After a short delay and a few more words, Shui Ying and Old Ma stood up and left. Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't ask them to stay. However, before Shui Ying left, she turned around and asked Supreme Lord Tianlan, "My lord, you said that you called me over for an urgent matter. I wonder if I still have." She didn't finish her sentence, but there was a questioning look in her eyes and expression. Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed and waved his hand. He said, "What urgent matter? It's fine, it's fine. You can go." Shui Ying smiled like a flower. She nodded in agreement. Then she left the hall with Old Ma. Before she left, she seemed to deliberately look at Lu Qin. There was a meaningful look in her eyes. Lu Qin was speechless. He only clenched his fists that were hidden in his sleeves. After Shui Ying and Old Ma left, only Supreme Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin were left in the hall of Kunlun. The atmosphere returned to a somewhat awkward silence. Supreme Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Qin. He didn't say anything. Instead, he clicked his tongue from time to time. Lu Qin couldn't take it anymore. He glared at him and scolded, "What are you clucking at? Look at your gloating face." Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed and pointed at Lu Qin. "Are you a good-for-nothing? You don't have many capable subordinates. Now your most trusted one has run away?" Lu Qin was about to retort. Suddenly he felt a chill in his heart. Although he said it as if he was joking, was there any truth in it? Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed for a while. Then he said in a softer voice, "I believe you also know that I can't refuse my reward just now." Lu Qin nodded slightly. He didn't have any objection to this. As the leader of a powerful force, he could act arbitrarily and be domineering. However, he couldn't act recklessly when it came to rewards. No matter what he thought in private, Old Ma had given him such an important treasure. It was of great significance to Supreme Lord Tianlan. He might even be able to continue his secret plan without having to deal with another divine transformation stage perfected cultivator. This alone was worth the position of a deputy hall master in Fuyunji. But why? Supreme Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Qin with a faint smile. "Did you fall out with Ma Xiaoyun recently?" "No." Lu Qin sighed and answered gloomily. Then he asked himself in his heart, "Why is that?" Chapter 643. From Lu Qin's point of view, no matter how he thought about it, he could not figure out why Old Ma would suddenly turn his back on him and stand on Shui Ying's side for no apparent reason. In fact, at this moment, his heart was filled with doubts. There were almost no emotions such as anger or even killing intent for revenge. If he had to list them himself, Lu Qin could tell Old Ma that he was stronger than Shui Ying and that his future prospects were better. At least 10 or 20 reasons would not be a problem. And Lu Qin himself believed that Old Ma was not a fool. He could see that true Lord Tianlan was cultivating Lu Qin as his successor, intentionally or unintentionally. In such a good situation, Old Ma had actually abandoned him, jumped off his ship, and boarded someone else's ship. There could only be one meaning. That guy did not seem to be optimistic about Lu Qin. Lu Qin knew old Ma very well and trusted him very much. It could even be said that old Ma was the person he trusted the most. So when this happened, although he did not show it on the surface, he was still surprised and a little suspicious about his situation. Could it be that he had overlooked something? Could it be that he had made a big mistake without knowing it? He shut himself in the quiet room and thought about it carefully for a while. He went through all the things that had happened during this period of time in his mind. In the end, Lu Qin found that although he had met a lot of people and things these days, and did not do everything perfectly, he basically did not make any mistakes. That would really be a ghost. After Lu Qin confirmed that there should be no major problems on his side, he began to doubt old Ma's intelligence. Was that guy really stupid? For most people on Sky Dragon Mountain, old Ma was not a person worth paying attention to. Even within Fuyunji in the past, old Ma was remembered as a person who followed behind Lu Qin all day long. He could be considered as one of the few subordinates of this true lord's successor. Lu Qin was in the limelight and his prestige was growing day by day, but old Ma had always been very low-key. Almost no one could feel his existence. Because of this, old Ma's switch did not cause too much of a stir in Zhangxianming and even in Fuyunji. Many people did not even know about it. However, within Fuyunji, especially within the small circle of the core, old Ma's decision to jump ship was like a sudden clap of thunder, strongly stimulating a group of people. This meant a lot. First of all, Lu Qin's closest confidant had betrayed him. This must mean that there was something wrong with Lu Qin's current situation. Everyone could think of this. After all, even Lu Qin himself could not help thinking about it after knowing about old Ma's action, to see if he had done anything wrong. In addition, there was another very important piece of news, which was that Lord Tianlan generously rewarded old Ma with a position as the deputy chief of Fuyunji. Although the actual power of old Ma had not been determined, this gesture had already explained a lot. Lord Tianlan actually approved of old Ma's betrayal, even though he had jumped ship with Lord Tianlan's only disciple, Lu Qin. Did this mean that Lord Tianlan's attitude towards his disciple had also changed a little? Because the matter of the Tree of God's branch fragment was very important, it was not actually leaked out. Everyone only saw those superficial things. Whether it was Lord Tianlan, Lu Qin, Xueying, or even old Ma himself, none of them would come forward to explain anything. Thus, amidst the flabbergasted cries, Lu Qin's originally great situation had inexplicably begun to show signs of being shaken by the wind and rain again. The Immortal City was the largest city in the world. It had a large population and was flourishing. Even at night, the lights at night were abnormally bright and beautiful, so much so that the night view of the Immortal City had also become a popular and famous scenery. The best place in the world to watch the night view of the Immortal City was on Mount Celestial Dragon beside the Immortal City. Every night when the moon was bright and the stars were sparse, standing on the high peak and looking down, one could see the huge city shrouded in the night sky. The lights were bright and dazzling, illuminating the night like the most precious jewels in the world, emitting a dazzling light that was intoxicating. There were not many people who could enjoy such a beautiful and rare scenery. Most of the time, only the people in Zhangxianming who occupied Mount Celestial Dragon had the right to do so. At the same time, some of the best scenic spots had long been occupied by the big shots in Zhangxianming, so there were not many good spots left to watch. Even if there were, it would be in some dangerous and high places that even cultivators did not like to go to. That night, Lu Qin brought Atu to a mountain peak that was deserted but had a good view. He brought some wine with him, and as he enjoyed the night view of the beautiful night view, he drank the wine. He looked very happy. The wind on the mountain was very strong, but the black dog did not respond to it at all. This dog's physique seemed to be rapidly evolving into the legendary divine beast. Even Lu Qin could feel the fierce undercurrent under the calmness. He thought that it was probably time for Atsu to return to the Great Snow Mountain soon. Vanity Fair. Lu Qin took a big gulp of wine and seemed to feel a little cold. He hugged Atsu and felt the warmth under the thick and soft fur. He rubbed his face comfortably and then murmured, "Atsu, do you know that below us is the world's biggest Vanity Fair?" Atsu looked back at him. Although this dog had become a little abnormal recently, it still did not seem to understand the word, Vanity Fair. Lu Qin did not bother to explain to it. He just stared at the lights at the foot of the mountain. After a while, he suddenly said, "In fact, I am almost the same as him. At the beginning all I wanted was to survive. Later the situation gradually changed and I got more things. In the end, even the damn Baldy had to protect me and give me such a big piece of cake." He smiled slightly self-deprecatingly and said, "Atsu, do you like eating cake?" Atsu stared at Lu Qin and shook its head firmly and solemnly. It seemed a little afraid that its crafty master, Lu Qin, would replace the monster meat with cake in the future. Lu Qin rolled his eyes at it, spread out his hands and said, "So now that I think about it, I can't blame old Ma because in fact even I have changed." He looked at the brightly lit city at the foot of the mountain and said, "Who doesn't want fame and fortune? It's good to have fame and fortune. If you can be a person above others, you can enjoy all the happiness in the world. Isn't this what people want in their life? Who is willing to follow behind others and be a minion for the rest of their life? Seeing that you have a bright future, do you want to be buried for the rest of your life?" "Why should I?" Lu Qin asked in a low voice. No one knew whether he was asking himself or Atsu, but Atsu did not seem to have any intention to answer. It raised its head and looked at the clear night sky. Suddenly, its eyes became serious and it looked into the distance. Then it suddenly shouted and roared. Lu Qin was shocked. He raised his head and looked in the direction that Atsu was looking at. In the distant sky, in the darkness of the night, a red light suddenly appeared. Chapter 644. The Blood Sea anomaly that shrouded the sky above the immortal city and the hearts of many people in Zhangxianmeng suddenly arrived in a very unusual way. Of course, in fact, the Blood Sea anomaly itself was an unusual thing, otherwise it would not be called an anomaly. However, this time, it was also the last Blood Sea anomaly that people expected. Even compared to the previous Blood Sea anomalies, it seemed very strange. First of all, it came earlier than most people thought. The feeling it gave people was, huh? It hasn't been that long, why is the last Blood Sea anomaly coming already? However, if one carefully recalled the time when the Blood Sea anomaly appeared in the past, one would find that the interval between each Blood Sea anomaly was indeed getting shorter and shorter. It was just that the interval in the past was still long, so it was not particularly obvious. It was not as shocking as the last Blood Sea anomaly. Of course, it was also possible that they knew in advance that this was the last Blood Sea anomaly. Something bad should happen, so the impact on people's hearts was greater. In addition to the time, the scene of the last Blood Sea anomaly was also completely different from the previous times. There was no longer the rolling waves of the Blood Sea that swept across the sky, no longer the dark red blood curtain that instantly covered the entire clear sky, and no longer the insufferably arrogant aura that engulfed the world when the Blood Sea anomaly appeared in the past. From the beginning, the Blood Sea in the sky seemed to have been resisted. Yes, from the very beginning, the Sea of Blood phenomenon didn't progress very smoothly, as if it was being resisted by some mysterious power. As a result, the Sea of Blood in the sky couldn't completely spread out. At the edge of the enormous celestial city, it was extremely difficult for the Sea of Blood to advance, and it even spread out to the sides. That night, Lu Qin and Atu, who had been standing at the peak of Mount Celestial Dragon, had witnessed the entire scene very clearly. They had witnessed the entire process from the appearance of the Blood Sea to its subsequent changes. At the same time, on Mount Celestial Dragon, Lu Qin was not the only one who sensed the appearance of the Blood Sea and observed this scene from various places. In Kunlun Palace Hall, Heavenly Law Hall, Starry Hall, Dezayuan and many other places, there were people quietly looking up at the sky this night, watching the arrival of this last Blood Sea phenomenon. When the mortals woke up in the morning, they would feel that the sky seemed to be slightly darker than usual. When they walked out of the house and looked up at the sky, what appeared in front of them was a strange sky. The sky was still the same sky, at least the sky above their heads was still the same. However, at the edge of the immortal city, a huge circle pattern appeared in the sky, and the surging Blood Sea still appeared in the sky. It drowned every inch of space in the sky visible to the naked eye, except for the top of the immortal city. It was as if this magical and huge city suddenly emitted some kind of powerful force on this day, blocking the evil Blood Sea outside the door. However, the Blood Sea refused to retreat and still lingered outside the door very fiercely, besieging, crashing, and slowly nibbling away the originally intact sky inch by inch, pushing inwards bit by bit. The originally intact sky was only left in the huge circle above the immortal city, and within the range visible to the naked eye, the dark red color at the edge was still pushing inwards. Things were changing. As the only successor of perfected Lord Tianlan, a core figure in the system of Fiyunji, Lu Qin quickly and nimbly received some news, and felt the undercurrent surging under the calm in Zhangxianmeng. This time it seemed to be really different from before. Most of the cultivators in Zhangxianmeng were still dismissive of the strange phenomenon in the sky, at least on the surface. Everyone looked very calm and everyone believed that man could conquer nature. Anyway, even if the sky collapsed, there were still 6 perfected lords of the divine transformation realm to hold it up. They were not afraid, and since they did not leave, what did they have to be afraid of? Fear came from ignorance. For example, the mortals in the immortal city at the foot of the mountain, each and every one of them dragged their families and fled desperately, wanting to leave the most prosperous city in the world as soon as possible. It was extremely ridiculous. Of course, at this time, there were also some impatient cultivators who wanted to know the opinions and attitudes of the few big shots. However, from the beginning of the strange phenomenon in the sky until now, all the perfected lords of the divine transformation realm had been silent. They did not come out to boost the morale, saying that it was just a change in the sky, nor did they come out to warn the crowd that it was very dangerous, and that everyone should run for their lives. They did not come out to tell the crowd that they should not be afraid, and that they were here to hold everything up. In short, they seemed to have suddenly lost their voices, living silently in those tall and magnificent palaces, without saying a word. This was, of course, a very puzzling thing. Many people did not dare to say much on the surface, but in private there were many speculations, but not to the extent of how bad it was. In fact, most of them were actually conspiracy theories. Based on past experience, everyone suspected that these few big shots were probably scheming against each other again, preparing to fight for power and profit, and kill everyone in a sea of blood, and so on and so forth. Lu Chen knew that what they said above was bullshit. Because as the person closest to perfected Lord Tianlan, he saw with his own eyes that Mount Sky Dragon, which had been relatively stable for the first 3 days of the strange phenomenon of the Blood Sea, began to become chaotic on the 4th day. The Blood Sea was still pressing in step by step, slowly pressing into the center. The area of the normal sky in the sky was getting smaller and smaller. Everyone knew that in the end, the Blood Sea would definitely devour everything. When that time came, who knew what would happen? On the night of the 4th day, it was a cold and mournful night. Lu Chen was the only one who was asked to stay by perfected Lord Tianlan to accompany him. Lu Chen asked the damn baldy why he asked him to stay, and perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything. He just patted him on the shoulder and said in a low voice, "Prepare to watch a good show." In the 3rd night watch period, a good show began. Sitting in the main hall of Kunlun, Lu Chen saw figures flashing outside the hall and the sound of footsteps. He and perfected Lord Tianlan went up to greet them. Looking at the damn baldy's expression, it was obvious that he already knew what was going to happen. Before walking to the entrance of the Great Hall, Lu Chen had already made many guesses about the people who might come tonight. The subordinates of the Floating Clouds Agency, Blood Warbler, Old Ma, or even some extremely well-hidden shadow. Did they suddenly have something important to report? Or maybe some enemies with bad intentions such as Supreme Guangbo of Dazai Yard, Supreme Tiehu of Heavenly Law Hall, or even Supreme Guyu of Starry Hall. When everyone's struggle for power and profit had reached the climax, should they draw their swords and fight each other? However, none of this was the case. When Lu Chen saw the people at the door, he felt that his brain was not enough to process it. At the same time, he vaguely felt that what was going to happen this time was probably a little bigger than what he had expected, although he already felt that his expectation was exaggerated. The person who came was of high status and usually kept a low profile, but even when perfected Lord Tianlan saw him, he had to greet him with a smile, cupped his hands and called him elder brother. His name was Golden Dragon. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon of the 6 perfected lords of Zhengxianming. Chapter 645. Zhengxianming was the most powerful force in the world, and its greatest asset was, of course, the 6 divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, who were unparalleled in the Immortal Alliance. With these great figures who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, their powerful subordinates, and the famous sects behind them, Zhengxianming could enjoy the limitless glory it had today. However, if a person who knew nothing about Zhengxianming had only heard about Zhengxianming in the past few years, then 3 to 5 years ago, he would probably think that there was only one big shot in Zhengxianming called Perfected Tianlan. But in the past 2 years he might have learned about a few other big shots such as Perfected Taihu, Perfected Guangbo, and Perfected Guyu. As for the other 2 divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, Perfected Golden Dragon and Perfected Lu Yun, their presence had always been very weak, as if they were a little weaker than the previous 4 divine transformation stage perfected cultivators. Of course, that wasn't the case. True Monarch Golden Dragon and True Monarch Lu Yun were both from prestigious sects and had the backing of prestigious sections. They also had the assistance of forces that couldn't be underestimated, so they definitely couldn't be underestimated. Of course, No one in the world dared to look down on a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator, except for a certain madman. However, compared to the glorious achievements of perfected Tianlan and Fiyunji, these two perfected cultivators were much more ordinary. Of course, in the face of the rare achievement of destroying the devil cult, even Tai Hu, Guangbo, and the other famous divine transformation stage perfected cultivators did not have an easy time in the past few years. Actually, everyone was about the same. Only Tai Hu, Guangbo, and the others would jump around a few times and make their presence known in front of the world from time to time. At the same time, they would fight for some benefits in the dark, which made people think that their strength was second only to Fiyunji. In terms of age and eloquence, perfected Golden Dragon was actually the oldest among the 6 perfected cultivators. Unfortunately, the true battle prowess of a deity transformation stage true monarch wasn't judged by how long one lived, and the rise and fall of the major powers had nothing to do with age. In the Vanity Fair of Immortal City in Zhangxianming, everyone was very realistic. Whoever could get the most benefits would be the boss. As for things like justice and so on, everyone just talked about it. When it was time to fight, no one was soft-hearted. Thus, after all these years, true monarch Golden Dragon was actually a person of high status, but the development of his forces was not very satisfactory, and he was slowly being marginalized. Lu Qin had met this true monarch once, and the location was, of course, at the ceremony where he was officially accepted as a disciple by true monarch Tianlan. He remembered very clearly that on that day, almost all the important figures in Zhangxianming had come. It seemed that everyone gave face to perfected monarch Tianlan, whose power was at its peak. Even if they didn't befriend him, at least they wouldn't turn bad and become enemies, right? It was with this kind of thinking that the damn Baldy and Lu Qin made a huge fortune at that ceremony. Perfected Golden Dragon was an uninvited guest, but this time perfected monarch Tianlan, who was too lazy to socialize and rude to most people, unexpectedly came to the door to personally welcome him. Then the two exchanged greetings and were very friendly. In the end, perfected monarch Tianlan even held perfected Golden Dragon's arm intimately, and the two of them walked side by side into the main hall of Kunlun. The surrounding servants had already been sent away, leaving only Lu Qin alone in the main hall. Perfected monarch Tianlan also did something even more unfathomable. He directly asked Lu Qin to close all the doors and windows around the main hall, isolating all the curious and prying eyes outside. As a result, the only people in the world who knew about the conversation between the divine transformation stage perfected monarchs were the 3 people in the main hall. The news quickly spread from Fiyunji. Xueying and the other leaders of Fiyunji quickly arrived with their elite troops. They quietly surrounded and guarded the main hall, and at the same time, drove away the spies in the open and in the dark, intentionally or unintentionally, a little further away. These things were done very appropriately and skillfully, because they had done this many times in the past. But this time, there was an additional face in the crowd that was somewhat familiar, but also a little strange at the same time. It was the newly promoted deputy hall master of Fiyunji, Ma Xiaoyan. Actually, there were many people who knew old Ma. Although he was not well known in the past, he had a soft hand in the dark and had a wide circle of friends. Otherwise, he would not have been so well informed, and had been Lu Qin's most reliable source of information for a long time. Because of this, most people in Fiyunji saw old Ma as being on the same side as Lu Qin. Especially after Lu Qin was accepted as a disciple by Lord Tianlan, old Ma became the #1 confidant of Lu Qin, the future master of Fiyunji, and his status also rose a lot. However, the world was unpredictable, and it was even more common in a treacherous place like Zhangxianming. Old Ma suddenly left Lu Qin, and became the deputy hall master of Fiyunji in one fell swoop. This change surprised many people. The deputy hall master of Fiyunji, and it was said that he was also in charge of the affairs of the shadow. He had a high position and power. No matter how they looked at it, it was like the old saying that was used on Lu Qin, reaching the sky in one step. Could it be that people on Lu Qin's side were born with this saying? It was so enviable. Old Ma stood in the crowd with a somewhat complicated expression on his face as he looked at the tall and grand hall that was currently closed. No one knew what he was thinking at this moment, but he had arranged all the matters at hand without any mistakes. About 5 or 6 feet away from old Ma, Xueying had a similar expression on her face as she looked at the Kunlun Hall. Her charming face was frowning slightly, and her expression was even more serious. This was because she knew that after today, the rumors that Lu Qin's position was unstable would be discredited. What else could prove how much Supreme Lord Tianlan valued Lu Qin than the fact that a demigod true lord would stay by his side during a private negotiation? Those rumors of discord between master and disciple had been spread for nothing. Shuiying sighed sorrowfully in her heart. Looking at the hall, she muttered to herself with some resentment in her heart, my lord, what exactly are you thinking? Could it be that my decades of following and exhausting myself are really not as good as that one Luchin? If you continue to force me like this, I really don't know what to do. She thought this in her heart, but she did not show any of it on her face. She stood quietly in front of the Kunlun Hall, just like she had done for the past 10 years. Her back was straight, her face was charming but cold, and she had turned herself into the sharpest blade in Supreme Lord Tianlan's hands, protecting him and blocking all hostility far away from him. However, she still had a feeling that after today things might be different. Chapter 646. True Lord Golden Dragon was the oldest of the 6 perfected cultivators in Zhangxianmeng, and he was also the most low-key one. Perhaps it was because he was old and had seen too many changes in the ways of the world, but this old man seemed to have become indifferent to many things. He rarely stood out and fought with others for things. Of course, the calmness mentioned above was only relative. In reality, true immortal Golden Dragon's strength was not weak. Normally, he would be able to get a share of the profits, so his days could be considered quite comfortable. It was only in the last few decades that the madman, True Lord Tianlan, suddenly rose to power and swept across the world with the Floating Clouds office that he had created. Not only did he defeat the devil cult and the evil path, but in reality, there was also a division of interest within the righteous path's true immortal alliance. When Fuyunji had just developed, these things were not obvious. Most people, including the other perfected cultivators in the divine transformation realm, did not think too highly of this rising star. The true immortal alliance had been established for several thousand years. How many outstanding talents, how many changes in the world, everyone had seen many of them. But no one expected the times to change and the madman took over. After True Lord Tianlan defeated the devil cult, he came back to steal from the alliance of the righteous faction, not giving them any face at all. To be exact, before Fuyunji defeated the devil cult, they had begun to fight with the forces within Zhangxianmeng, both openly and secretly. This did not seem to be a wise move. There were strong enemies outside and they still had to fight among themselves. It seemed like a suicidal move. But the reality was that the other forces within the Alliance of Immortals all felt the threat of Fuyunji, and they all began to secretly suppress them. This kind of fight was not up to Fuyunji alone. Fortunately, this world, which was supposed to teach the rising star how to behave according to the rules, finally met a madman who did not follow the rules, and this madman was very powerful. True Lord Tianlan and his Fuyunji finally broke the rules, became the boss and grabbed the biggest piece of the cake. In the face of powerful deterrence, another rule of this world quickly came into play, and that was the survival of the fittest. The other forces in the Alliance of Immortals easily bowed their heads, and everyone lived in peace for the time being. After that fight, True Lord Golden Dragon and the other perfected Lord Luyun kept a low profile and did not show up much. Most of the time they only said that they were in seclusion. Instead, the other younger perfected lords such as Guangbo, Taihu and Guyu were still struggling outside. This was the sequence of events. Speaking of which, True Monarch Gold Dragon was more or less forced by True Monarch Tianlan and his Floating Clouds company. However, on this night in Kunlun Palace, True Monarch Gold Dragon appeared to be very gratified as he chatted happily with True Monarch Tianlan. As the only person in the hall who was watching these two big shots, Lu Qin saw their words and actions as he poured tea, and his heart was not calm either. These two perfected lords of the divine transformation realm seemed to be chatting about their daily lives, and did not mention the general trend of the world. As for the imminent appearance of the blood sea in the sky, they seemed to treat it as if it had never happened and did not exist. They did not mention a word about it. If the people outside saw or heard this scene with their own eyes, they would probably be stunned, because even Lu Qin himself was secretly thinking that these two big shots would probably have a fierce exchange of words, or bargain for the sake of great benefits, or simply plan some terrifying and frightening conspiracy. In the end, none of them happened. True Lord Golden Dragon looked back on his life and the many years he had spent on Mount Celestial Dragon in Zhangxianmeng, and he sighed with emotion. Perfected Lord Tianlan repeatedly said yes, and even said that when he had just arrived, he had been taken care of by True Lord Golden Dragon. Now that he thought about it, it seemed like a lifetime had passed. True Lord Golden Dragon laughed heartily, saying that he had already seen that Perfected Lord Tianlan was a young man with great talent, and that he would definitely achieve great things in the future. Now it had really come true. Perfected Lord Tianlan modestly said that this was all because he had learned from his predecessor, and that he had achieved this little achievement by standing on the shoulders of a giant like his predecessor. Lu Chen couldn't help but cast a sidelong glance at him because his words were so mushy and his manners were so courteous. He thought to himself, could it be that this damnable Baldy has been possessed by a ghost? I've never seen him so courteous to someone in over 10 years. After chatting for a while, True Lord Golden Dragon actually stood up and took his leave. During this time, Lu Chen did not hear anything useful. For a moment he was also confused by this old man. It was not easy for him to come here, so why did he come? It couldn't really be just for a chat, could it? Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be especially calm, and he sent True Lord Golden Dragon to the door with a smile. However, the moment before the door opened, True Lord Golden Dragon suddenly sighed, looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "Sure enough, the new generation excels the old. I didn't expect you to be even calmer than this old man." Lu Chen's spirit was instantly lifted, and he looked at the damn Baldy out of the corner of his eye, only to see Perfected Lord Tianlan smiling and saying, "Senior, you flatter me. If you have something to say, please feel free to say it." True Lord Golden Dragon stared at him for a long time, and after a long silence, he suddenly opened his mouth. His expression was a little desolate for the first time that night, and he said, "Tonight I originally wanted to join the game. Whether it was on your side, Tiehu, or Guanggua's side, it would be good if I could get something." Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled without saying anything, and his expression was gentle. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon said indifferently, "Did I tell you that when you suddenly stop being crazy and become polite and considerate, you look even scarier?" This time, Perfected Lord Tianlan was startled and then he laughed. "That's not true." As he said that, he even turned his head to look at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "Is that true?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and then said, "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlan and Perfected Lord Golden Dragon both looked at Lu Chen's face, and after a while the two looked at each other and smiled. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon nodded. "Your disciple is not bad." Perfected Lord Tianlan actually had no intention of being polite. He said, "That's true, or else I wouldn't have liked him." Perfected Lord Golden Dragon pointed at him, and then he frowned and said with a solemn expression, "I'll withdraw from Mount Li and Mount Li. I won't take advantage of you and I won't part with the money. How about it?" Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be surprised at these words, and as if he was getting to know this old man all over again, he sized him up and said, "You actually want to leave? Are your subordinates willing?" Perfected Lord Golden Dragon said indifferently, "I should be the one in charge of the sect. If I say I want to leave, I'll naturally leave. If there's anyone who isn't willing, then don't stay under me." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him for a while and suddenly asked, "Did you discover something and that's why you came to find me?" Perfected Lord Golden Dragon smiled. "That's not important. I'm just asking you, my lineage isn't willing to be enemies with you, and I also don't want to stay on this celestial dragon mountain any longer after seeing the terrifying phenomenon in the sky. I want to bring my descendants back to my hometown to live for a few years. There are many implications in this. I wonder if you want to force me to stay as an enemy or let this old man live." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a long time and finally nodded. "There are indeed crouching tigers and hidden dragons among the heroes of the world. You can't underestimate them." With that, he waved his sleeve and bowed solemnly and said seriously, "Senior, please leave. We'll meet again if fate allows it." Perfected Lord Golden Dragon chuckled and turned to open the door to leave. However, his voice traveled far and he said, "Forget it. It's best if I don't see you for the rest of my life." Chapter 647. There are truly too many smart people in this world. Lu Chen thought to himself as he watched True Monarch Golden Dragon's departing figure. This was especially true in this immortal city, which was known as the largest city in the world, where the best talents in the world gathered. Those who could climb up from Zhangxianming were all elites. Those who were not as experienced in the ways of the world would have long been swept away, buried, silent, or died a silent death somewhere. Mount Heavenly Dragon was vast and majestic, but the highest peak was still extremely narrow, small to the point that only a few people could stand. Moreover, the path from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain was already packed with people. There were many precipitous cliffs along the way, and every time one stuck one's head out to look into the deep valley, one would see piles of white bones below, and they were all traces left behind by those who had failed. In terms of the intensity of the struggle for power and profit, Zhangxianming was even worse than the devil cult. However, it was in such a fierce and cruel Vanity Fair that True Immortal Golden Dragon, who had stood at the top for many years, suddenly retreated. Although Lu Chen could feel from the negotiation just now that this veteran perfected god of transformation seemed to have some other intentions at the beginning, if true immortal Tianlan did not respond well, or if true immortal Golden Dragon sensed some clues that he could take advantage of, perhaps true immortal Golden Dragon would change his face and join the battle ferociously. But now it seemed that all this was just wishful thinking. After a seemingly indifferent chat with true immortal Golden Dragon suddenly made such a big decision and retreated without any hesitation. He even asked for a promise from true immortal Tianlan. Lu Chen didn't know whether true immortal Golden Dragon had sensed some kind of danger, or if he had suddenly been seized by a sudden impulse to look at the surging sea of blood. In short, this big shot had suddenly appeared and left overnight, taking with him a powerful force and leaving behind an empty space that was enough to make people drool with greed. What should we do? Lu Chen asked true immortal Tianlan beside him. True immortal Tianlan asked in return, what should we do? Lu Chen said, after true immortal Golden Dragon left, he left behind so many properties and profits. Should we rob them? Snatch. Without any hesitation, perfected Lord Tianlan said in a righteous manner, there's no reason for us not to rob. The reason why the old man came to inform us was to show him some respect and let him leave unscathed. As for the meat he left behind, it's just our intention. If I don't snatch it, that old man will laugh at me. Oh. Lu Chen nodded and said, that's right. Then he paused and said, how about this? You've been very busy recently, so let me help you with this kind of hard work. How about it? Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment and suddenly sized up Lu Chen. After a while, he suddenly chuckled and said, you're enlightened, lad. It's all because of your guidance. I'm a slow learner and I've disappointed you, Lu Chen said calmly. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud and clapped. Approved. Let me see what you're capable of. Don't lose to those trash from the other halls. Lu Chen said, of course not. However, even the cleverest housewife can't cook a meal without rice. Since you've asked me to do this, shouldn't you at least transfer some of the men from the Floating Clouds agency to me? Perfected Lord Tianlan squinted his eyes slightly, but the smile was still on his face. He even clicked his tongue and nodded. I thought you were going to show me some unparalleled divine power or some uncanny scheme to complete this great undertaking on your own. Why are you still asking me for men in the end? Lu Chen said, I'm not an immortal. Anyway, as long as you give me men and those old soul formation cultivators don't show up, I'll definitely settle this matter for you. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and pondered for a moment. It seemed that he didn't care much about Lu Chen's request. He said, with me sitting here, if I don't show up, I don't think Tai Hu, Guangbo, and those other trash will dare to come out and fight for you. So, it's probably up to you juniors to rely on your own abilities. Later, I'll give you an order to get a batch of elites from Fiunji to follow you. Lu Chen said straightforwardly, don't go back after you follow me. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a faint smile. After a moment of silence he said, isn't your table manners too ugly? Lu Chen snorted and said, in the past I was too concerned about table manners and was polite in everything. I always thought that there was still a long way to go, so I had to leave some face for now. Unfortunately, they didn't appreciate it. Now that I think about it, I'm really stupid. From the beginning, when you took me in as your disciple, you probably didn't want someone who was tactful and timid, right? Perfected Lord Tianlan first shook his head, then nodded and said, tactful and worldly wise isn't a bad thing. In life, if you blindly advance bravely, you'll only hurt yourself and others. But you're someone who's going to do great things in the future, so you still need to have the courage and the nature of a tiger and wolf. He patted Lu Chen's shoulder with a somewhat gratified look in his eyes. Fortunately, you finally thought it through. When Perfected Lord Tianlan turned around and walked into the depths of the hall, Lu Chen suddenly said to his back, Shuang should still be loyal to you. Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps paused for a moment, but he didn't turn around. He only asked calmly, why do you suddenly say that? As he spoke, he seemed to have thought of something. After pondering for a moment he said, I remember that recently, you and Shuang seemed to be at odds with each other. Why are you speaking up for her today? Lu Chen said, these are two separate matters. I just want to say that I'll naturally do what I have to do. But doing this is equivalent to dividing Shui Ying's authority. Will she have any reaction? It's fine if she hates me, but if she's dissatisfied with you, have you thought it through? Perfected Lord Tianlan fell silent. After a while he finally turned around again and looked at Lu Chen with a deep gaze. He said, Why does it sound like you're trying to sow discord? A little. Lu Qin actually admitted it in an unusually frank manner. From his expression he didn't seem to mind at all. He said, "But you can't deny that what I said is the truth. Shuiying has been with you for more than 20 years and is your closest confidant. I didn't think that I would become a fool in the end." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and looked at Lu Qin. "What are you trying to say?" Lu Qin met his gaze and walked up to him. "Are you suspicious of her and are purposely trying to reduce her authority?" His voice wasn't too loud, but his words were still very clear. The hall was silent for a while. Then, Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled with a somewhat emotional expression. "Even Shuiying doesn't dare to speak to me like that," Lu Qin said, "so, you took me in as your disciple." Perfected Lord Tianlan couldn't help but laugh. The atmosphere in the hall immediately relaxed. He looked at Lu Qin and turned to leave with a smile. He didn't reply to Lu Qin's question. It was just that after a while, a low voice came from the direction of Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure. "I heard that in the past 10 years, there have been many new people in Fiyunji who only know Hallmaster Shui but not Perfected Lord Tianlan." Lu Qin stood in the empty hall and silently lowered his head. After a long time, his lonely body trembled slightly. Chapter 648. Many people had seen True Immortal Gold Dragon go to Fiyunji's territory and meet True Immortal Tianlan in the main hall of Kunlun. However, the cunning True Immortal Tianlan did not let those spies have a good time and talked behind closed doors. Except for Lu Qin, no one else knew the details. This also caused the other forces on Mount Celestial Dragon to speculate. There were all kinds of speculations. Did the two big shots fall out, collude or fight for power? Everyone was thinking about all kinds of possibilities. But soon, True Immortal Gold Dragon, who was unusually agile this time, made a decision and action that shocked the entire Zhangxianming. He was retiring and returning to his hometown. Of course this was a joke, but True Immortal Gold Dragon really announced to the public that he was old and weak, and that he missed his hometown. He was going to leave Mount Celestial Dragon and return to his home sect, along with a large group of subordinates. Zhangxianming was not the imperial court of the secular world, and True Immortal Gold Dragon was not an ordinary person. In the world of cultivation, how could a divinity transformation stage perfected cultivator like him retire and return to his hometown? There must be something fishy about it. Everyone immediately realized this, but for the time being, apart from those involved, no one knew the truth. With such a great force leaving, the power vacuum and various benefits left behind were enough to make people salivate. Everyone could only be happy, so how could they go back to stop it? Therefore, all the famous people came out to sing praises for True Immortal Gold Dragon, saying that he had worked hard these years and that it was time for him to go home and enjoy his old age. The rest of the troublesome work and the work of fighting for the justice of the world should be left to the young people. Of course, there were also different voices of opposition in the True Immortal Alliance. Most of them came from True Immortal Golden Dragon's own forces. Among them there were many young talents who were in high spirits. How could they be willing to leave the center of power, the world's largest Vanity Fair, the most flourishing, dazzling and bewitching city of luxury? Thus he jumped out and strongly objected. True Immortal Gold Dragon used a very straightforward method to suppress these disharmonious youngsters who didn't agree with his boss. "If I say I'm leaving, I'm leaving. If you don't listen, I'll beat you until you listen. If you don't listen, I'll break up with you. Our fate ends here. Don't follow me after I leave. Go with someone else." This caused quite a commotion. After all, the human heart was full of desires. Everyone wanted to climb up as fast as they could. You, True Immortal Golden Dragon, have been in that position for so many years. Presumably you've enjoyed everything you can. If you want to retreat now, no one will care. But if you want to retreat, so be it. If you insist on blocking someone else's path, then you are an enemy. As a result, there was a lot of commotion, chaos, and everyone went to their own homes. In the end, Golden Dragon True Monarch left Celestial Dragon Mountain with half of his followers, while the rest were quickly divided up by the other forces. From this, it could be seen that although the Zhangxianming organization was terrifyingly powerful, in terms of internal cohesion, it really couldn't compare to those famous sects that had thousands of years of inheritance. There were too many opportunistic and scheming people. Everyone was smart and had their own ideals to fight for. The forces under a divine transformation stage True Monarch were once powerful, but once they decided to retreat, they would instantly shrink by half. This was like an ugly beach that had been exposed after the tide had receded, naked in front of the whole world. The blood sea anomaly in the sky didn't stop. It was still spreading and pressing toward the sky above the immortal city. However, the phenomenon this time was completely different from the previous ones. At the same time, the invisible resistance seemed to be far stronger than before. After a few days, the torrential sea of blood still covered less than half of the sky, and its speed was much slower than the previous ones. But no one knew if there would be a next time after this blood sea anomaly. Perhaps the sky above their heads would never be able to see the original light again? When such a terrifying and strange anomaly was happening above their heads, the atmosphere on Celestial Dragon Mountain in the Immortal City didn't change much. It seemed that too many people didn't care about the atmosphere of the apocalypse. In their eyes, fame and fortune were more important. After defeating the devil cult, the whole world and the vast land of the divine continent were invincible. On the towering Celestial Dragon Mountain, these cultivators who stood at the peak of the human race finally fought among themselves. Humans were really animals that loved infighting. Perhaps seeing the blood of their own kind would make most people excited. Lu Qin felt that he was about to become such a person. He led a group of Fiyunji elites to fight and kill for the interests of those empty foundations in Celestial Dragon Mountain, the Immortal City, and even in various dark corners. He clearly felt that recently, everyone seemed to have become more aggressive. It was probably because they didn't care much about their face for the sake of benefits. That thing is mine, no one else is allowed to touch it. If you touch my things, I'll take your life. Therefore the Immortal City began to bleed and die. Even if the blood sea anomaly above their heads had not yet closed, and the doomsday had not yet arrived, people had already begun to kill each other. Lu Qin felt very funny in his heart. Then he performed the best and most valiant in the infighting. Under his excellent leadership and performance, Fiyunji once again showed its powerful strength in the infighting in Zhangxianmeng. It repeatedly defeated those who were sent to fight for territory and interests, such as Heavenly Law Hall, Dezayuan, and Starry Hall, making him famous. This was because the number of people assigned to him was, at most, less than half of the Floating Clouds Company's elites. In other words, Lu Qin had led half of his people to utterly defeat the other halls, seizing the biggest piece of cake in this bandit's feast. His performance was very outstanding. He commanded calmly, he was fearless of life and death. He even personally killed several people in front of others. When he used the blade or even his hand to stab the enemy's chest, there seemed to be a smile on his face sometimes. Among the Floating Cloud Service's men who followed him, there were quite a few who vividly described the scene at that time. Afterwards, they said with certainty that Lu Chen's expression at that time was very similar to true Lord Tianlan's when he was young. It was even possible to say that they were carved from the same mold. This sentence was really memorable, and it quickly spread throughout the whole of Fiyunji and Zhangxianmeng. When the overall situation was almost settled, Supreme Tianlan completely ignored the other infuriated good-for-nothings and publicly praised Lu Qin. He laughed out loud and unceremoniously gave most of the properties that he had robbed to Lu Qin, and then assigned those subordinates to Lu Qin. In the blink of an eye, the strength in Lu Chen's hands was already vaguely similar to that of the second Fiyunji. In Zhangxianmeng, who else could be a match for such a terrifying Supreme Tianlan and Fiyunji? If one could not do it, then the people who were stimulated could only speed up the pace of the alliance. The atmosphere became more and more tense, like a surging sea of blood in the sky that was slowly but gradually approaching a desperate situation. A bloody smell grew thicker and thicker on Mount Celestial Dragon. Even many years later, when the survivors who had experienced that scene recalled it, they would find it strange. There were so many cultivators, so many smart people, but why were all of them so bloodthirsty and excited? Chapter 649. Looking down from the top of the Celestial Dragon Mountain, one could see the bustling immortal city as far as the eye could see. At a glance, there were endless layers of pavilions that seemed to extend beyond one's sight to the horizon. Even the people who lived in the biggest city in the world all year round could not help but sigh at the magnificence of this city again. This was the biggest center of power in the world and also the biggest Vanity Fair in the world. It was something that countless cultivators dreamed of. No matter what kind of request it was, it could be realized in this city. Of course, it was just a possibility. Cultivators were also human, and they also had desires and emotions. When Old Ma stood on the top of the mountain and looked down, he had a similar feeling in his heart. Now, Old Ma could be considered to have experienced the feeling of reaching the sky in one step. Perhaps the height of this climb was still a little lower than Lu Chen's, but it did not matter. The position of the deputy chief of Fiyunji was already a position that countless ordinary cultivators in Zhangxianmeng dreamed of. His fat body stood on the mountain. When the mountain breeze blew, Perhaps he did not have the elegant bearing of a tree in the wind, but old Ma himself felt very good. He should be a little more handsome than before, right? Then he pursed his lips and revealed a slightly bitter smile where no one could see. The city at the foot of the mountain looked quiet and peaceful, and it was as prosperous as before. However, as a high-level person who had obtained a certain status, old Ma also knew more secrets and news than before. He knew that under the peace, there was a bloodshed slowly spreading. The atmosphere on the celestial dragon mountain was still relatively calm, but the few important halls actually did not interact much with each other. Everyone kept their distance, and when they met on the road, their eyes were filled with vigilance and hostility, lest this inexplicable and gradually fierce civil war suddenly spread to them. Yes, in the seemingly peaceful Zhangxianming, even though everyone acted as if nothing had happened, in fact, this could no longer be considered an ordinary dispute in the immortal city, but a fierce battle in the dark. Although bleeding, injuries and broken limbs looked terrible, it was still within the scope of control. However, in the immortal city, in order to fight for the power vacuum after true Lord Golden Dragon left, the battle soon developed to the point of death. Everyone was a cultivator, an elite, very strong and also very smart. By the way, everyone seemed to be in a bad mood recently. There was a stifling feeling in their hearts, and they always wanted a place to vent it. Normally they were all under the same true immortal alliance, so they had to take into consideration their faces and the forces of the various halls. None of them dared to act recklessly. However, in the past few days, all the people under the halls seemed to have suddenly discovered a frightening fact. It seemed that killing people was no big deal. After the first person died, the scale of this battle began to expand rapidly. Everyone's attacks became fiercer and fiercer. Every slash was not to scare people away but to really want to see blood and kill people. Sometimes even people who were usually more gentle could not help but become cruel and ruthless killers under such an atmosphere. In this chaotic battle, Fuyunji relied on its own powerful strength to gain the upper hand. At the same time, many people also saw the performance of the future successor of true Lord Tianlan. Lu Chen looked like a killer among killers. Old Ma heard a lot about Lu Chen's performance during this period of time, and he was a little worried about it. For some reason he felt that something was not quite right, but he could not put his finger on it. He only felt that Lu Chen had been with him for many years. At least, the Lu Chen he knew in the past should not be such a person. But old Ma was not completely sure in his heart, because he also knew more deeply than others that Lu Chen was once the best shadow in the world. This person could even completely change himself into another person when needed, including his personality. He used this powerful and terrifying ability to severely damage the Devil Sect, and laid the foundation for the destruction of the Devil Sect. Therefore, although old Ma felt that something was not quite right, he still could not be sure whether Lu Chen was still pretending or not. This person, even his old friends of more than 10 to 20 years, did not dare to say that they could completely recognize him. How scary was that? Old Ma shook his head, and the worry on his face deepened. The road under the city in the distance, on the ancient road leading to the outside of the immortal city, now looked very lively, and it looked like a contrast with the bustling immortal city. But most of the people walking on the road, the densely packed people, were people who were in a hurry to leave. There was an inexplicable and strange phenomenon above their heads. In this city on the ground there were fights and killings every 2 or 3 days. You could even see blood splattering and corpses everywhere in the streets. This kind of place was suitable for ambitious people and adventurers, not for ordinary people who wanted to live in peace. Old Ma sighed and sat down on the spot. He had stood in this place for a long time and also waited for a long time. Places that were rarely visited were usually places with extremely dangerous peaks or harsh environments. Perhaps such places would occasionally have beautiful scenery, but after a long time, it was actually very uncomfortable. Damn it. Old Ma muttered as if he was cursing, but also as if he was complaining about something. After a while he sighed and seemed to be a little discouraged. At this moment of silence, even the mountain breeze suddenly became a little quiet. Old Ma narrowed his eyes slightly and looked into the distance. Suddenly he only felt a pain on his back, as if a hard object had suddenly pressed against his back. Unbeknownst to anyone, there was something so close to him. In an instant old Ma's face turned pale. His fat body suddenly tightened at this moment, and his spiritual power suddenly gathered. When he saw that the strength he had hidden for many years was about to burst out in an instant, the words behind his back were like a basin of cold water poured over his whole body. Lu Chen asked me to say hello to you. The voice was low but soft and it sounded like a woman. At the same time, the hard object seemed to be particularly sharp, and it instantly pierced through his clothes and went straight to his back. Old Ma seemed to be frozen. He stood stiffly in the same place and did not dare to look back. The expression on his face looked very strange. After a moment of silence, he whispered, "Lu Qin?" "Yes." "What are you going to do?" Old Ma asked. "Kill you," the person behind him said, and the tone of the voice seemed to have changed again. Old Ma sighed and said, "If you want to kill me, just kill me. Why do you have to pretend to be him?" The person behind him made a sound of surprise and said, "Didn't you just betray him? Is it wrong for Lu Qin to want to kill you?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "He won't kill me and he didn't send you." The person behind him was silent. Old Ma smiled bitterly, then slowly took a step forward, letting his body slowly move away from the sharp blade on his back. Only then did he turn his head to look at the charming woman behind him. He smiled bitterly and said, "That's right, Old Ma. Miss Song, you will scare me to death by doing this." Chapter 650. I didn't expect it to be you. Song Wenji, the most cherished adopted daughter of the first seat of Heavenly Law Hall Immortal Tiehu, who was known for her enchanting beauty and at the same time, was also an outstanding talent of the young generation in the Union of True Immortals. Standing behind Old Ma, she looked at him, frowned slightly and suddenly said such a sentence. Old Ma didn't seem to be surprised or angry at Song Wenji's somewhat brainless words. He even nodded and said, "More or less, I also didn't expect it to be you." Song Wenji didn't say anything. Her beautiful eyes flickered and stared at the fat face of Old Ma, her gaze as sharp as a knife. Old Ma took a step back and raised his hands as if to express his helplessness and harmlessness. He said, all right, I didn't mean anything else." Song Wenji snorted and put away a strange weapon in her hand. Old Ma took advantage of this gap and secretly glanced at her hand. In that hasty glance, he felt that the weapon seemed to be a bit like a strange hook. But Song Wenji's movements were very fast. That weapon disappeared from her hand in an instant and no one knew where it went. "Why not Lu Qin?" Song Wenji sneered and looked at Old Ma with a bit of ridicule in her eyes. She said, "Could it be that the person he trusts the most is you? It seems that Lu Qin is just a chess piece on the surface." Old Ma shook his head and said seriously, "How can we guess the thoughts of that person?" Song Wenji curled her lips and looked as if she didn't care. Then she said, "All right, let's not talk nonsense. What does that person want from me?" Old Ma took out a sealed envelope from his bosom and handed it to her. He said, "He didn't tell me either. He just gave me this letter and asked me to pass it to you. He said that you would know what to do after reading it." Song Wenji's expression changed slightly. She stared at the letter for a moment and was about to reach out to take it when she suddenly retracted her hand. She then took out a pair of thin leather gloves from her bosom and put them on. Only then did she solemnly receive the letter. He looked as if he was facing a formidable enemy, as if he was afraid that the letter would be laced with poison, or that the thin letter contained some extremely dangerous and frightening mechanism. Old Ma was also a little stunned. After a while he couldn't help but say, "It can't be like this, right?" Song Wenji glanced at him indifferently and said, "If you say it's not necessary, then it's not necessary. I'm not familiar with you. Besides, who knows if you've colluded with someone in secret to harm me?" Old Ma was speechless. He just waved his hand and said nothing. Song Wenji carefully opened the letter and took out a piece of paper from the envelope. She was very careful throughout the process, but things were just as Old Ma said. Nothing happened. Song Wenji remained calm and composed. She didn't feel embarrassed at all. On the contrary, she even took 2 steps back, further away from Old Ma. Only then did she open the letter and read it, looking like she didn't believe anyone at all. Old Ma also felt helpless. He thought about it and decided to show that he didn't have any ulterior motives, so he simply took a few steps back. Song Wenji was originally about to read the letter, but at this time she slightly raised her eyes to look at him. But that was all. She didn't show any other expression on this charming woman. Then, her gaze focused on the letter and she carefully read it. Old Ma had the letter for a long time, but he really didn't peek at what was written on the letter along the way. First, he didn't have this intention, and second, he really didn't dare to. But this matter clearly showed that what was written in the letter was the most important, so he also stared at Song Wenji, wanting to see something from her expression. But from beginning to end, Song Wenji's expression didn't change at all. It was as if she had just finished reading an ordinary letter that didn't matter. After she finished reading, she silently folded the letter with her thin leather-gloved hands, and then she rubbed her hands a few times. Suddenly, a flame emerged from her palms. Green smoke rose and the paper was ignited. Old Ma subconsciously took a step forward. Song Wenji raised her head and looked at him. Old Ma immediately stopped and spread his hands to show that he didn't have any ulterior motives. Song Wenji faintly looked at him. The flame on her palms burned very quickly and soon, the entire letter was swallowed up, and all the words on it were burned to ashes. The woman let go of her hands and the flame dimmed. The ashes drifted away with the wind, and the disappeared words turned into nothingness, scattered between heaven and earth, and could no longer be found. Old Ma looked at her and suddenly felt that the scene in front of him seemed a little familiar. It seemed like the young man from many years ago. They both stood in the dark shadows, silently and alone. In an environment that ordinary people might go crazy, they persevered and tenaciously lived. Sometimes even Old Ma himself would wonder what supported such a person. "I'm leaving," Song Wenji said very casually as if nothing had happened before. "It's almost dawn." When she left, she seemed to say this with some emotion, and there was a bit of a gratified look on her face. Then she really left this place and didn't look back along the way. Old Ma stood where he was for a while and then looked up at the sky. He saw the sea of blood in the sky, rolling and gloomy, still pressing towards the center of the city. The sky would only get darker and darker and there was no sign of it getting brighter. Old Ma sighed and turned to look at the ancient roads at the edge of the immortal city in the distance. He looked at the people who were still leaving the bustling city in an endless stream, and said to himself in a low voice, "It's not that Master doesn't trust him, maybe he wants to protect him. As for me..." His voice gradually became lower, and there was a bit of self-mockery on his face. His voice didn't sound too real. In the end, Lu Qin still felt that there seemed to be something wrong with him. The reason why he only realized it after a long time was because he finally realized that there seemed to be an important person missing from his side. In the past days, that seemingly useless fatty was actually the only one who would tell him the truth and give him timely advice. Now that he was gone, in this period of time, Lu Qin felt like he had returned to the feeling of being in the devil sect in the past. He let go of the shackles in his heart and looked down on life and death more and more. His attacks became heavier and heavier, and killing became easier and easier. Moreover, after killing he would get a faint sense of pleasure. This was something that he had never encountered when he was in the devil sect. Atsu woke him up. One morning when he woke up, the first thing he saw was a pair of bloodthirsty red eyes. Lu Qin was shocked and then suddenly, as if he was enlightened, he suddenly woke up from his trance. The events of the past few days quickly floated up in his mind, and then he broke out in a cold sweat from the shock. What the hell? Chapter 651. The pair of bloodthirsty, strange and ferocious-looking eyes were, of course, not a real evil spirit, nor was it a prank played in front of Lu Qin with a mirror. It was the black dog lying beside him, looking at him. Lu Qin was the person who knew Atsu the best in the world. After all, they had been together for so many years. Lu Qin knew that Atsu had many secrets that others did not know. For example, the black dog's bloodline as a divine beast, the process of its transformation into a holy beast, the green light that flashed in the depths of Atsu's eyes in the dark of the night, and the fact that after a life-and-death crisis, Atsu became the second existence in the world to possess the power of black fire. Yes, Lu Qin had never told anyone about Atsu's secrets, not even to the people who were once closest to him, Tianlan and Old Ma. Perhaps somewhere in his heart, he knew that at the last moment, the one who was most likely to be by his side was this black dog. But for so many years, Lu Qin had never seen Atsu's eyes shining with such a bright red light. They looked like two pools of blood, giving people a bloodthirsty desire. Lu Qin's heart trembled and he subconsciously clenched his fists. At this moment he seemed to suddenly wake up from a dream, only to find that he did not realize that he had been in a dream. Since when did this feeling start? Lu Qin slowly sat up and thought silently for a while. Then he turned his head to stare at Atsu again. Soon he found that although there was a strange red in Atsu's eyes, the dog's mental state did not seem to be affected much. It was not the kind of bloodthirsty monster that would rush up and bite any living creature to death, then drink its blood and eat its flesh. It looked no different from before. The strange smell of blood dyed Atsu's eyes red, but it did not affect its mind. Lu Qin reached out and hugged Atsu, gently stroking its head. Although what he had experienced this time was very strange, he had indeed experienced too many things in the past years. In fact, similar things had happened in his memories. Atsu seemed to be particularly resistant to such strange attacks that could affect one's mind. Not to mention ordinary beasts, even most human cultivators were no match for it. There was nothing much to explain about this kind of powerful potential. If it had to be said, it could probably only be attributed to the powerful and abnormal divine beast bloodline in Atsu's body. Lu Chen even suspected that Atsu had something to do with his sudden awakening this morning, although he didn't know what Atsu had done. However, when he carefully thought about it, scenes began to emerge in his mind. In his memory he had done a lot of things. If it was really a dream, Lu Chen probably remembered that he had once incarnated into a godlike figure, leading a large group of subordinates to fight unhindered. Blood flowed everywhere as if it had smeared the entire huge city. Was the fight that fierce? Lu Chen sat on the bed and was stunned for a moment. He felt that his mind seemed to be a little confused. He vaguely remembered that he had led a group of elites of the Floating Clouds Company to fight against the people of the other halls in order to help true Lord Tianlan fight for his territory. However, this kind of fight was definitely a small-scale one, and it might not even be something that could be seen in public. Casualties were unavoidable, but there definitely wouldn't be any large-scale casualties. But why did it seem that in his memory, there were corpses everywhere and blood flowed? It seemed that something was not quite right. Lu Chen felt it, but for the time being he couldn't figure it out. He shook his head, thinking that this inexplicable strange thing was very dangerous. Even he didn't know that he had fallen into a trap. Obviously there was some terrible trap or strange thing around. Even if what he thought before might be an illusion, the thing that could produce such an illusion was also extremely terrifying. It should be known that it could even affect the mind of a cultivator like Lu Chen. Although Lu Chen had always been strong-willed and calm, at this time the first person he thought of was still Supreme Tianlan. That damn Baldy should be able to see through the strangeness of this and solve these strange problems, right? Thinking of this, Lu Chen's originally somewhat uneasy heart suddenly calmed down a lot. He quickly felt the change in his mood. Although he was still vigilant for a moment, he couldn't help but feel a little funny. Why did he suddenly feel like he had suddenly returned to his childhood? He was still the child who held the damn Baldy's hand? He believed in him like that. Lu Chen shook his head gently and laughed somewhat self-deprecatingly. Just as he was about to turn over and get off the bed, his body suddenly stiffened the moment his feet touched the floor, and he stopped moving. At that moment, there was a sudden tumble in his mind, and actually more images came surging out. It was a scene that was even more intense and bloody. He led his men to victory in the battle for the territory of the Immortal City, and when Fuyunji became even more arrogant and insufferably arrogant, for some unknown reason, the scale of this battle gradually began to expand. Originally, at this time, the big bosses of the various mountains in Zhengxianming, which were the few divine transformation perfected lords, should have appeared. Everyone would look at their respective profits and the number of casualties, and then they would sit down and have a good chat based on the current territory division, bargaining like businessmen. At most, they would each take a step back. Everyone would look good and everyone would get some benefits. Then everyone would be happy and the world would be at peace. But this time there was actually no such thing. The few divine transformation perfected lords actually did not appear. Therefore the blood that flowed became redder and more people died. The situation gradually began to get out of control. In Lu Chen's memory, the clearest image was that the world seemed to always be red, as if it had been smeared with blood. He remembered that he went to find perfected Lord Tianlan for the last time, but he forgot what exactly he said. The only thing he remembered was that perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be looking at him with deep meaning, and that pair of eyes that were as deep as the sea was shining with a strange light. He finally said, "It's almost daybreak." The fur on Atsu's body was still as soft and smooth as he remembered. Its body was still leaning against Lu Chen's side, and the place within reach was still warm. This was perhaps the only thing that Lu Chen felt somewhat comforted at this moment. His mind was in a mess as if it was in a mess. Countless images seemed to be fragmented and mixed together, making it difficult for him to distinguish them. Only the last sentence that perfected Lord Tianlan said to him in his memory, that, "It's almost daybreak," was becoming clearer and clearer in his mind, and the echo was getting louder and louder. Dawn is coming? Lu Chen lowered his head and thought for a long time. Then he suddenly stood up, and with a cold expression, he strode to the door of the house. After taking a deep breath, he suddenly pulled hard and the door opened with a squeak. Then he walked out. The sky was dark red, gloomy, like a tumbling sea of blood. There was no sign of daybreak at all. At some point in time, the world had actually been completely swallowed by a sea of blood. Chapter 652. When the sky full of red light sprinkled down and shone on Lu Chen's body, he couldn't help but be dazed for a moment. At that moment, as if he had suddenly received some kind of stimulation, the black fire in the depths of his body suddenly ignited. Like a wave, it rapidly surged through the meridians in his body and washed through them. Then, the strange aura that he hadn't even noticed before had invaded his body was instantly incinerated. Lu Chen's body shook slightly and his eyes immediately regained clarity. It was also at this moment that he finally completely woke up. This night had been very long, so long that he was almost unable to wake up from his dream. It was also at this moment that those memories that were almost hidden finally began to slowly surface in his clear mind. He hadn't forgotten those things that happened a long time ago. He still remembered those things that happened recently. It was as if although he looked no different from an ordinary person before, he had lost his memories like a walking corpse. He was still that person but not complete. The battle in Immortal City became more and more intense after the appearance of the Blood Sea, and under the circumstances that the few divine transformation perfected lords didn't come out to stop it for some reason, the situation began to go out of control day by day. The fighting between the several parties became more and more bloody and tragic, and more people died. Everyone gradually became bloodshot. At the same time, after Golden Dragon Perfected Lord took the lead to withdraw from the battle and left Immortal City, another big shot who had been silent for a long time, Perfected Lord Lu Yun, also seemed to be unable to bear the pressure of the impending storm. Following Golden Dragon Perfected Lord's example, he also led his subordinates out of Immortal City, the center of the world's power. In this way there was another delicious piece of meat. The parties in the battle swarmed forward and fought even more fiercely. Lu Chen looked up at the sky, his expression cold and somber. Although he didn't know why the power of the black fire in his body would suddenly awaken and expel that strange power at this time, the most important thing was that he had regained consciousness. And once he regained consciousness, it didn't take Lu Chen much effort to notice that there was clearly something strange about the current situation. Of course, this couldn't be a simple internal conflict in Zhengxianmeng. It was an internal conflict between the big forces represented by the divine transformation perfected lords for territory. As long as there was something wrong with their brains, they would be able to see that although this was intense, it was not in line with the actual interests of those big shots. Zhengxianmeng was a great flag that represented justice and righteousness. It represented the moral high ground of justice. Everyone stood under this great flag and said, "You are an evil demon, I will punish you on behalf of justice." Naturally, the opponent would flee in defeat. Not to mention fighting back, it would be difficult for them to even talk back. Wasn't it the best time to live such a beautiful and relaxing life where everyone ruled over the world? Other than a lunatic who would want to completely destroy the banner of Zhengxianmeng. Crazy? Lu Chen was stunned for a moment, thinking that there really seemed to be a lunatic here. It was impossible to reason with a lunatic, even if the reason was exceptionally clear and obvious. However, a lunatic would not follow the rules, especially when that lunatic had this kind of ability. Then things would become very scary and easily get out of control. However, Lu Chen soon thought of another point that made him puzzled. Even if the damned Baldy was a lunatic and unreasonable, what about the other three divine transformation stage immortals? Could it be that Tai Hu, Guangbo, and Guyu had also become lunatics? Madness could be contagious. Lu Chen didn't know why, but when he thought of this he suddenly felt a little funny and then he laughed out loud. He looked at the sky and then at the world that was shrouded in a dark red radiance. The top of Mount Celestial Dragon was dark, with red clouds pressing down and thunder rumbling. From time to time, lightning would burst out from the distant clouds and tear the sky apart. It looked like the end of the world. However, Lu Chen did not look worried or afraid at all. He looked at everything in front of him and shook his head. He thought that if the world was destroyed, then so be it. He had never thought about the people of the world. Although he had done great deeds for the people of the world, such as destroying the devil cult, he did not know when it started, but the idea of fighting for the people of the world, which was instilled in him by the damn Baldy since he was a child, had gradually faded. Perhaps only the damn Baldy was still obsessed with it. "Atsu, let's go," Lu Chen said to Atsu, who was squatting at his feet. Atsu responded in a low voice, stood up and walked forward. Lu Chen glanced at it and found that the body of this black dog seemed to have grown bigger. He was silent for a moment, sighed and said, "It seems that you have been eating well recently." Atsu turned its head and looked at him. Its eyes were bloodshot, but its gaze was not fierce. Perhaps in this world only Lu Chen could make it look like this. "Where should I go?" Lu Chen muttered to himself. After a moment he smiled and said, "Forget it, let's go find the damn Baldy." This blood sea anomaly is too strange. Not only does it hurt others, it can also hurt ourselves. I have a feeling that if this goes on, I'm afraid that the people of the Immortal City will go crazy. I have to tell him that he can't go on like this. Atsu did not comment and just followed him. They had woken up from this inexplicable nightmare. What they faced in front of them seemed to be a bigger and more vicious nightmare, and there was no sign of it ending and waking up. However, as he walked, Lu Chen's mind was still a little messy. Even though he had recalled everything that he should remember, even though he felt that he should have returned to being a complete person with the help of the Black Flame's power, he still felt a little confused. But that feeling of loss still surrounded him. He felt that there was still a piece missing in his heart. This feeling was very strange. He couldn't remember, but he always felt that he still remembered something, or rather he should remember something. When countless fragments of the past found their place in his mind, the blank in his memory was like a fog, curled up in a corner but still lingering. Occasionally he could see bloodstains on the road in front of him. Lu Chen thought for a moment and remembered that 2 days ago when the war entered the most chaotic and tragic stage, there seemed to be an assassination here. He looked around. It was very quiet and there were no enemies or friends. Maybe it was because it was still early? Or because everyone was tired? Or could it be that this strange battle had suddenly ended while he was in a dream? He saw the towering and majestic temple of Kunlun from afar. He was in a trance for a moment and then he suddenly woke up. He shook his head violently and looked up at the blood sea in the sky. His eyes were slightly cold, and then the power of the black fire in his body burned again, instantly dispersing the cold and strange aura. His mind calmed down again, but Lu Chen's heart slowly sank. Things seemed to be worse than he had imagined. He hesitated for a moment and decided to find true Lord Tianlan first. He brought Atsu into the world and walked towards the towering temple. Then he found that there seemed to be no guards outside the heavily guarded temple today. It seemed that he really didn't see a single person along the way. It seemed that he was the only person left in this world. Suddenly, he felt a hair-raising chill slowly spread out from his back. Chapter 653. What kind of feeling was that? It was probably the feeling of suddenly wondering if he was still trapped in a dream and hadn't woken up yet. What was worse was that this dream looked so realistic. For a moment, even Lu Chen himself couldn't tell whether he was awake or not. Fortunately, he had Atsu with him. This lazy but loyal black dog had never left him. When Lu Chen subconsciously reached out and stroked Atsu's back, the familiar warmth from the skin of his palm quickly calmed his somewhat throbbing heart. Lu Chen calmed himself down, walked over and hugged Atsu and whispered, "Fortunately you are still here." Atsu rubbed its head against Lu Chen's hand, then barked at the Kunlun temple not far ahead. Its voice was low and seemed to be a little vigilant. Lu Chen looked at the tall and majestic temple. Under the deep sea of blood and red clouds, the light and shadow intertwined and changed, like a giant standing in front of him. The doors and windows of the temple were closed, making it impossible to see the situation inside. Occasionally there were some gaps, but it was still dark. Lu Chen didn't continue to move forward. He frowned slightly and lowered his head to think for a while. Then he seemed to have made a decision in his heart. He said to Atsu, "Something is a little strange. Let's not go there for the time being. Let's go to other places first." After saying this, Lu Chen turned and left. He didn't look back along the way. Even his pace seemed to have become decisive, as if he had already thought it through in his heart. He had regained his previous firmness and decisiveness. Atsu followed Lu Chen and took a step forward. Suddenly, it turned back to look at the majestic Kunlun temple. A pair of blood-red eyes stared at the darkness in the red clouds. After a while, it suddenly growled as if to demonstrate and also as a warning. Then it turned around and trotted, chasing after Lu Chen. After leaving the Kunlun temple, Lu Chen walked down the mountain with Atsu. Because the entire sky of the huge celestial dragon mountain was completely covered by the strange sea of blood, the mountain range was also shrouded in a dark red light. It seemed that everywhere was stained with the color of blood. There were layers upon layers of shadows, making one's hair stand on end. But this was not the first time that Lu Chen had seen such a situation. In fact, in his memory, the sea of blood that had appeared in the sky above the immortal city in the past was stronger and more serious each time. At that time, although there was still a gap in the sky that had not been submerged by the sea of blood, Mount Tianlong was basically like this now. The difference was that the phenomenon at that time did not really affect anything. There were still many people walking around Mount Tianlong. At least it looked like a normal human world. But now there was no one. So where did everyone go? When passing by the Fuyunji temple, which was not too far from the Kunlun temple, Lu Qin glanced in that direction. In the past, a group of elites led by Shuang were stationed here, and they had made great achievements. They defeated the devil cult, swept away the enemies, and pushed the name of Lord Tianlan's faction and Fuyunji to the peak. The entrance of the hall seemed to be empty as well. There was no one there. Lu Qin did not go near there. He just stood in the distance and stared for a while. His expression became even more solemn, and then he turned and left. The road down the mountain looked the same as before. There was no change except that it was much more deserted. Like before, there was not a single person in sight. Even the guards that were usually seen were gone. The scenery on both sides of the road looked the same as before. Apart from being dyed with a layer of dark red light, it looked the same as before. The ancient trees were dense and the branches spread out. Along the way, only the sound of Lu Chen's footsteps could be heard on the stone steps. As he walked, he suddenly frowned, stopped, and looked back. The black dog was following behind him. Sensing that he had stopped, it also stopped and looked up at Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at it, rolled his eyes and said, "You little fella, do you not make a sound when you walk now?" Atsu wagged its tail and took 2 steps forward. Sure enough, when it stepped on the stone steps of the mountain road, it did not make a sound at all. If one did not see this dog standing here with their own eyes, they might not have noticed it. It gave people the feeling that it was like a lurking and ferocious beast. Lu Chen snorted and shook his head. Just as he was about to step forward, he suddenly felt something and stopped again. He turned to look at a certain spot in the forest next to him. After a while, he suddenly strode in that direction. Atsu was a little puzzled. It looked at Lu Chen's back, not understanding what he was going to do. The moment Lu Chen walked into the forest, the light around him seemed to dim a little, as if the only source of light was blocked by his figure. The forest was very quiet and there were branches and weeds everywhere. Lu Chen looked around and did not move. He looked like his whole body was standing there like a stone, and even the sound of his breathing was silent. After an unknown period of time, the quiet forest slowly began to change, as if something that had been suppressed by the shock had begun to unfold once again. A small, soft and low voice was crying somewhere in the grass. If one did not come close, if one was not in this quiet place, it would be very difficult to hear. Lu Chen's eyes lit up. His gaze swept over the grass where the sound came from, and then he walked over. The sound suddenly disappeared, but Lu Chen had already reached into the grass and rummaged around a few times. After a while, he withdrew his hand from the grass, and in his palm, there was a little bird. It was a very small bird, and it looked less than half the size of a palm. Even the feathers on its body were not fully grown. Its eyes were closed and it curled up in Lu Chen's palm. Its whole body was slightly trembling, but one could still feel the inherent warmth of life from its weak body that seemed like it could break at any time. Lu Chen looked at this small and fragile bird, and the corner of his mouth suddenly showed a trace of a smile. He stood up, held the bird, and turned to walk out of the forest. Atsu squatted on another mountain path, looking a little bored, but after seeing Lu Chen come over, especially when it saw the little bird in his hand, Atsu suddenly became excited. It barked, jumped up and opened its mouth to bite. With a paw sound, it was Lu Chen who slapped the black dog's head to the side and shouted, "It's not for you to eat." Atsu was a little depressed and it growled twice, still staring at the bird. The bird's whole body was trembling violently, as if it was about to be scared to death. Lu Chen's eyes were calm and he stared at the bird in his hand. After a moment he said to Atsu, "Let's go, this bird is the first living thing we saw at least." He smiled, looked into the distance and walked forward. He said lightly, "At least it proves that we are not the only 2 alive in this world. Let's go, let's find those who are still alive." Chapter 654. Perhaps the bird was too frightened or too weak, but after it was found by Lu Chen, it almost never struggled. Even when Lu Chen put it in his arms, the bird curled up and remained motionless. However, the slightly narrow and dim environment in his arms made the bird calm down. Perhaps it was the warmth of Lu Chen's body that made the bird feel supported. At least it didn't tremble like before. It seemed that the little bird had suffered a great shock a few days ago, but Lu Chen silently glanced at Atsu, who was following beside him, from the corner of his eyes. This muscular and tall black dog had been guarding him from the moment he woke up. It seemed like Atsu had woken up from the nightmare that he had lost his consciousness in the past. Obviously this black dog was also affected. Its eyes turned blood red. However, Atsu was obviously not like this bird. His body was basically intact. It seemed that it had survived that unknown mysterious time with ease. It did not lose control of its mind and even seemed to have evolved a little. Its strength seemed to be a little stronger than in Lu Chen's memory. However, other than facing Lu Chen, there was an obvious murderous aura emanating from him whenever he looked at someone else. From a long time ago, Atsu had not been interested in this kind of ordinary bird food. It would not hunt for it at all. But just now, when Atsu saw the bird and was about to pounce on it, Lu Chen could clearly feel that if he did not stop it, Atsu would probably bite the bird to death. Not to eat its meat but simply to bite the bird to death. A shadow flashed across Lu Chen's heart. He stretched out his hand and gently touched the head of Atsu who was walking beside him. Atsu looked back at him with a gentle expression and whispered. However, when paired with its pair of blood-red, fierce eyes, it still made people shudder with fear. The path down the mountain was the same as usual, but today it felt much longer than usual. Perhaps it was because the surroundings were too quiet. While walking, Lu Chen's mind did not stop. Instead, he kept thinking about the strange puzzle that he had encountered. Since he woke up, apart from Atsu and the half-dead bird he had just found, he hadn't seen a single living thing on Mount Tianlong, let alone a living person. So, where did all those people go? Lu Chen could not imagine what kind of power could wipe out all the people on Mount Tianlong. It should be known that the people here were the core and elite forces of Zhengxiameng. At the same time, they were also the most powerful people in the entire human cultivation world. Was there a force in this world that could annihilate so many powerful cultivators in one fell swoop? It definitely didn't exist in this world. At this moment, Lu Chen suddenly thought of the scene of the fallen god spell that he had seen in the barren valley many years ago. Although he had personally destroyed the god-subduing spell formation, destroyed the 1,000-year plan of the devil cult and inflicted heavy damage to the devil cult, which caused a chain reaction that caused the devil cult to suffer a great loss in the following decades and gradually weakened and perished. However, the unimaginable power that appeared in front of him that day, the grand momentum that was about to come to the world, still often appeared in his nightmares, waking him up from his dreams. Lu Chen shook his head, threw those unpleasant memories out of his mind, and then looked up at the sky. Not to mention, although the vision of the sea of blood in the sky looked very different from the vision caused by the fallen god's spell in the night of the barren valley, there were some similarities in the momentum that covered the sky and the sun. They walked on the mountain road for a long time, but there was still a time when they would finish walking. However, along the way, Lu Chen still didn't see a single person. From the top of the mountain to the foot of the mountain, he didn't see a single living person. The situation could no longer be described as strange, it could even be described as terrifying. Could it be that there really was a powerful unknown force that suddenly came to this world, destroyed everything, and wiped out all the human clan? Even someone as strong as perfected Lord Tianlan couldn't resist it? But how could that explain that Lu Chen was still alive? Standing at the foot of the mountain, Lu Chen looked back at the tall and majestic Mount Tianlong. He was the only living person along the way. If one day you were the last person left in the world, how would you feel? This kind of boring question had actually been raised a long time ago, and then many people fantasized with joking or exaggerated emotions. After all, no one believed that such a thing would happen. Lu Chen also heard of this topic, but he never took it to heart, nor did he think about it. But now, along the way, even though there was a shadow of this question looming in his mind, it was only at this moment that this question finally appeared clearly in front of him. Because when he stood at the foot of the mountain and looked around, the bustling immortal city at the foot of Mount Tianlong, with countless wide streets and layers of pavilions and houses, appeared before his eyes. It was deserted and there was no one in sight. Where did everyone go? Why was he still alive? Facing this terrifying and huge empty city, the first feeling that Lu Chen felt was not fear, but confusion and astonishment. He still couldn't figure it out. If a disaster really happened, what was so special about him that allowed him to survive on Mount Tianlong? The sound of footsteps on the street, which was originally inconspicuous, was exceptionally clear in this place that was as silent as a dead city. Lu Chen frowned and looked around carefully as he walked. Everything seemed to be the same as before. The shops were open and the pavilions towered, but the people were gone. The sea of blood rolled in the sky above his head, blocking all the light, making the long street look a little dim. Everything around him was dark red. There seemed to be something in the eyes of the light, staring at him from a dark corner. As Lu Chen walked, he suddenly stopped and stopped. Atsu, who was following behind him, also stopped. Lu Chen lowered his head and glanced at his bosom. The lapel there trembled slightly a few times. It was the little bird that had originally calmed down and seemed to have fallen asleep in the warmth of his embrace. For some reason it suddenly woke up and then its body began to tremble violently. He gently patted it with his hand trying to appease the bird, but it was of no use at all. Lu Chen thought for a while, then slowly raised his head and looked forward. On the dark red street with a touch of demonic light, a corner in front of him suddenly lit up with spots of green light. After a while, a group of snake-like things crawled out from the corner. The sound of hissing echoed in the silent street, making one's scalp tingle. Lu Chen stared at the monsters in front of him, looking at the snakes, with 3 eyes on their heads. His pupils suddenly shrank and then he took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Blood worms." Chapter 655. Hiss 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 hiss. A strange and deep sound came from the terrifying mouths of the ferocious-looking blood worms. In the gaps between the many sharp and fine teeth, one could vaguely see a snake-like tongue rolling around. A few drops of venomous saliva dripped from the corners of their mouths. Those green eyes stared at Lu Chen as if they were not looking at a person, but a walking lump of flesh and blood food. Lu Chen's pupils constricted slightly. Of course, this was not the first time he had seen this kind of strange and terrifying creature. The last time he saw this kind of blood worm was when he was on the Kunlun mountain. Lu Chen clearly remembered that it should be close to the night of the full moon. When he felt the strong but unexpectedly familiar power in the depths of the Kunlun mountain, he thought that all the blood worms had disappeared after the night of the full moon. But now it seemed that he was obviously wrong. Some kind of power had reappeared in the immortal city and brought this kind of terrifying creature again. What he did not know now was whether something strange had happened in the immortal city or whether some kind of power from the Kunlun mountain had come here. The next moment, Lu Chen almost instantly remembered the time when he went to the forbidden area of the Kunlun mountain. In the dark underground world between the clouds, he had encountered an almost unimaginable black dragon that used the power of the Kunlun seal. If he didn't guess wrongly, perhaps he was the one who brought the black dragon from Kunlun mountain to the immortal city. The Kunlun seal was then handed over to perfected Lord Tianlan. Since then Lu Chen had never seen the Kunlun seal again. Of course he had never seen the black dragon again. Now it seemed that during this period of time, the black dragon did not hide in the dark anymore. Instead it stood out. As for what it had done, Lu Chen still had no idea. Hiss hiss. Accompanied by a strange chirping sound, the few blood worms seemed to be unable to resist the temptation of fresh meat. They opened their mouths and opened their eyes wide. Then, without any visible movement, these blood worms leaped up from the ground and shot towards Lu Chen like arrows that reeked of blood. Looking at those ferocious mouths with sharp teeth in midair, if they were to land on a body of flesh and blood, it was almost unimaginable what would happen next. Lu Chen's expression was solemn as he stared at the blood worms that were charging towards him. His expression was grave, but there was no fear in his eyes. He took a step back. At the same time, 2 balls of black flames burned in his eyes. Pooh! Like a sharp knife piercing through leather, there was even a layer of trembling ripples in the air. In the blink of an eye, the fastest blood worm had already reached in front of Lu Chen. However, when it was 2 to 3 feet away from Lu Chen suddenly stretched out his right hand. His 5 fingers formed a claw and his arm quickly appeared like a ghost, directly grabbing the body of the blood worm. The crimson worm started to wriggle, but before it could turn around and bite the hand, a ball of black flames gushed out from the palm and engulfed the crimson worm. Gee! A sharp and hair-raising scream was instantly heard from the ball of black flames. The blood worm desperately twisted its body in the black flames, as if it was crazy and wanted to get rid of this terrifying nightmare. However, its body was firmly grabbed by the black flames. Then the black flames burned mercilessly. In just a short while, the blood worm's skin and flesh were torn open, and then it directly melted. Yes, this strange, mysterious and terrifying blood worm was completely melted in the black flames. Hiss hiss hiss. At this moment the other blood worms also rushed over at this moment. Lu Chen's face darkened and he did not retreat anymore. He threw away the burnt blood worm in his hand and waved his hands continuously. Instead of retreating he advanced. The black flames burned wildly in the air, instantly swallowing several blood worms. Ear-piercing screams were heard continuously, and it made one's scalp tingle. In the blink of an eye, more than half of the ferocious crimson bugs were burned to death by the black fire. The remaining 2 crimson bugs saw that the situation was not good, so they forced themselves to stop, turned around in midair, and fled frantically to the side. However, at this moment, a black shadow suddenly rushed out from the side. It was Atu. Atsu growled in a low voice and its blood-red eyes flickered strangely. It opened its mouth wide and with a cry, it actually directly bit the two bloodworms in mid-air. Luchin was shocked. Just as he was about to warn Atsu to be careful, he saw that after Atsu landed on the ground, it turned around and looked at him with its mouth fiercely biting. After a short while, a stream of blood flowed out of its mouth, and the cries and squeaks of the bloodworms quickly disappeared. Black Dog, who was eating the bloodworms, looked even more terrifying with blood dripping from the corner of its mouth. Luchin swallowed the words that were about to come out of his mouth. After a moment of silence, he retracted his hands, and the black flames in his palms quietly extinguished. The bloodworms fell to the ground one after another, looking like candles that had been burned by a raging fire. Luchin looked at Atsu, and Atsu stared back at him with blood dripping from its mouth. The long street regained its silence again. The two of them just stared at each other, and there was a faint atmosphere of confrontation between them. After an unknown period of time, suddenly, there was a moment when they both shifted their gazes at the same time and looked forward together. Luchin strode forward with Atu by his side. Just like they had done countless times in the past, they walked together into the unknown, inseparable, never to be separated. The little bird in his arms had quietened down, and it did not make a sound for a long time. Luchin reached into his arms and gently touched it. Under its soft feathers, the little bird's body was still warm, and he could still feel its heartbeat. Although it was fragile, it was still tenaciously alive. Perhaps the death of the bloodworms had calmed the little bird down, or perhaps it was because Luchin's warmth had finally made the little thing trust and rely on him for a long time. It began to get used to Luchin's aura, and it no longer struggled or moved around. Luchin and Atsu continued to walk in this immortal city that had suddenly become empty. In front of him, there seemed to be a fog and an unknown and mysterious future. When he was still on Mount Heavenly Dragon and walked to the outside of Kunlun Palace, the reason why he did not enter the palace was because he acutely sensed that there seemed to be an extremely terrifying power hidden in the darkness of the palace. That cold killing intent caused him to shrink back at the sight of it. That was probably an instinctive sense of vigilance that arose from his many years of being a shadow. That was not the aura of perfected Lord Tianlan, but another force. After weighing the pros and cons, Luchin decisively chose to leave and go down the mountain without hesitation. Indeed, as he had guessed, the immortal city and Sky Dragon Mountain were one, and the strange phenomenon on the mountain was not spared at the foot of the mountain. Things were getting stranger and stranger. Luchin decided to go to Horse Washing Bridge first. If he remembered correctly, there was an injured white lotus in that house. Chapter 656. Luchin had walked the road to the Horse Washing Bridge countless times. It could be said that he was very familiar with it. Even if he closed his eyes, he would probably be able to find his way there. Since he had already made up his mind, he started to walk in that direction. The empty city, the deserted streets, and the occasional gust of cold wind brought about a terrifying chill. Along the way, the bloodworms that they encountered just now were like a lid being opened. After that, Luchin and Atsu were attacked a few more times. One of the attacks that attacked them were also bloodworms. Other than that, there were all kinds of strange monsters. Luchin could clearly see that although these road-blocking tigers still maintained their original appearances, it was obvious that they were affected by some kind of strong external force and became more violent and ferocious. They were especially greedy for fresh blood and flesh. Almost as soon as they saw Luchin and Atsu, they immediately attacked. Fortunately, although these monsters were ferocious and strong, Luchin and Atsu had their own trump cards, so it was not too difficult to deal with them along the way. Especially Luchin's black fire, it was especially useful in this kind of battle. It seemed to have a natural restraining effect on these bloodthirsty monsters. However, these bloodthirsty monsters had one thing in common, and that was that their eyes were almost all blood red, similar to Atsu's eyes. In the fierce battle, there would occasionally be some bloodthirsty demon beasts that stopped in their tracks after seeing Atsu's eyes, as if they had seen their companions and were puzzled. However, Atsu would often take advantage of this opportunity to rush forward without any hesitation, or break the opponent's limbs, or bite the enemy's throat without any mercy. Along the way, Luchin found that the people in this huge city had disappeared. It had become the world of these monsters. As he gradually went deeper into the immortal city, the number of bloodthirsty monsters that he encountered along the way increased. It was as if the city had been completely occupied by them. However, at least it was no longer deserted. The howls of the monsters, the splatters of blood, and even the wails of the people at the moment of life and death added a cruel liveliness to the deathly silent city. To put it simply, it seemed to be a little more lively. After killing 4 to 5 waves of monsters in a row, Luchin decided to be careful and avoid them. He led Atsu to hide their tracks, lurking in the dark. They even went directly to the houses on both sides of the road. They sneaked through roofs, alleys, and even broke the walls of 2 houses to move forward quietly. In this way, although they would occasionally encounter 1 or 2 monsters in the house, the number of enemies they encountered was greatly reduced. Normally, it would take about half an hour to reach the horse-washing bridge. But today Luchin and Atsu walked for an hour. Then they stepped on a tall building and saw the horse-washing bridge in the distance. There is fog on that bridge. Perhaps it was due to the illumination of the sea of blood in the sky, but the fog appeared to be a faint red, and it pervaded the entire horse-washing bridge. But what was strange was that the fog only seemed to block the bridge and the road behind it. Luchin stared at the bridge and the fog. His face was somewhat gloomy. He felt that the fog was somewhat familiar. It was very similar to the fog that he encountered in the Immortal City's catacombs. Coincidentally, the last time he went to look for White Lotus, he also encountered this strange thing. Then this time at the horse-washing bridge, when he went to look for White Lotus, he also encountered this dark red fog. Was it really a coincidence? Luchin did not believe that there were so many coincidences in this world. As a shadow, if he believed in these things, it would be very difficult for him to live long. Just as he was deep in thought, suddenly Atsu, who had been quiet all this time, suddenly raised its head. It stared at the depths of the fog and then let out a low roar. That roar was not loud, but it was enough to alarm Luchin. Luchin's eyes slightly flashed, and he frowned as he looked at the bridge in the fog. He saw that the originally peaceful fog suddenly had some movement, and the speed at which it circulated became a bit faster. After a moment, a shadow suddenly walked out of the fog. Because the distance was very far, and there was also the fog blocking it, Luchin could not clearly see the appearance of the shadow. Even the outline was very vague and he could not even tell whether it was a person, a ghost, or a demonic beast. It was basically just a black shadow. Just as he stared at that direction with rapt attention, preparing to wait for the thing in the fog to walk out, the shadow in the fog suddenly stopped. Then from the fog came a sharp whistling sound. The whistling sound spread in all directions, and even caused some echoes in the empty streets, adding a bit of desolation and terror. Not long after, on the streets around the horse-washing bridge, a large number of various demonic beasts and monsters suddenly appeared. They flocked from all directions and then gathered under the horse-washing bridge. At that moment, Luchin felt as if he was watching a strange scene of a king and his subjects attending a court. All of the monsters crawled outside of the fog, and when the whistling sound stopped, 5 or 6 monster leaders walked out from the group of monsters. They were clearly stronger than the surrounding monsters, and then respectfully placed a few things at the edge of the fog, which was the side of the horse-washing bridge. The shadow in the fog faintly swayed, and the surrounding bloodthirsty monsters suddenly lowered their heads a bit, seeming to be scared to death. After a while, the fog spread out and expanded a bit, then slowly retracted again. Just as it advanced and retreated, the things on the ground all disappeared. All the bloodthirsty monsters in the surroundings, including the leaders of the demonic beasts, heaved a sigh of relief. Everyone screamed at the top of their lungs, sounding extremely ferocious and terrifying. However, after Luchin witnessed this scene from the beginning to the end, he felt that these guys did not seem to be demonstrating, but rather venting their joy. After shouting like this for a while, all of the bloodthirsty monsters turned around and left. In the blink of an eye, they scattered like birds and beasts, and the horse-washing bridge returned to its original tranquility. The fog was faint, and the shadow in the fog had already disappeared. It was unknown where it went. Luchin stared at that place for a long time, and then let out a long turbid breath. He turned his head to look at Atsu, and just as he was about to open his mouth to speak, he suddenly discovered that Atsu was already staring at him. Its pair of blood-red eyes were very strange. Luchin was startled for a moment, and then thoughtfully asked Atsu, "What do you mean?" Atsu wagged its tail, and its head nodded in the opposite direction. Luchin bitterly smiled, scratched his head and said, "You're really straightforward, running away as soon as you say you want to." His voice was only halfway through when he suddenly stopped. Then his expression changed slightly, as if he suddenly noticed something, and he was stunned into contemplation. After a moment, Luchin slowly stopped in front of Atsu. Staring at its pair of red eyes, he softly said, "Strange, why is it that from the moment I discovered that everything here is wrong until now, the thought of running away has never flashed through my mind? Why did I have to come here to save White Lotus, and not directly turn around and leave this immortal city? Is this what I should do?" Chapter 657. Shadow was a very special profession, but at the end of the day, all shadows were still human beings. They also had the 7 emotions and 6 desires of humans. At most, they had gone through rigorous training to be able to strictly control the various desires that they were born with. But this was only control, not erase. In this world, there was no method that could completely turn a person into an emotionless animal. Even if you turned a person into a fool, he would still be afraid and would also be happy. This was something that could not be changed. Every shadow was a different person, each had their own different life and different characteristics, including Luchin. Only on this point, all the shadows were the same, the only difference was their ability to control their desires and emotions. Luchin had always been very good at controlling his emotions and desires, otherwise he would not have been able to lurk in the evil cult for so many years, and under the most dangerous environment in the world, he would not have been able to accomplish such great feats. But he was still a normal person. He also had times when his emotions fluctuated. When he recklessly killed Sumo, it was one of the few times when he lost control of his emotions. And because his ability to control his emotions and desires was far better than ordinary people, Luchin was far more sensitive to his own emotional fluctuations than ordinary people. He knew that he would also be afraid and also shocked, but he would suppress all negative emotions in the shortest possible time, and restore his calm. But this time he felt something strange and different. He found that after he woke up, although he encountered all kinds of strange and terrifying things, he seemed to be able to calmly judge from beginning to end, without any shock or fear. His emotions were calm and could even be described as indifferent. If not for the fact that Atsu was by his side when he saw Atsu, he would still have some ripples in his heart, but Luchin almost felt that he really was like a walking corpse. A walking corpse. Luchin silently sat down, his back leaning against the wall. This tall building that was dozens of feet away from the horse-washing bridge was deserted, without any sound. Luchin closed his eyes, carefully listening, and very quickly confirmed that there really was no sound around him. The only thing he could feel was his own heartbeat. Other than that, there was only silence. Luchin felt that at this moment he should have felt a chill or even fear, but he did not. After a moment, Luchin opened his eyes and slowly turned his head to the side. Atsu was still sitting beside him, guarding him like it had done for many years. When he turned his head, Atsu even stuck out its tongue and wagged its tail. Luchin stared at Atsu and after a while he softly said, "Atsu, I can't feel your breath." Atsu did not seem to understand Luchin's words, and continued to look at him quietly. His pair of strange blood-red eyes flickered, and his gaze was gentle. He still looked like the black dog from before. Luchin was silent, and after a moment of silent thought, he suddenly reached into his bosom and took out the little bird that was hidden in his bosom. The little bird was still curled up in his palm, its head hidden under one of its wings, and did not move for a long time. Luchin gently stroked the feathers of the little bird with his fingers, and then realized that the body of the little bird had become cold without him noticing. He could not feel the body temperature of the little bird, let alone its heartbeat. In his palm, it did not seem to be a stubbornly living bird but an ice cube. Luchin coldly looked at the little bird in his hand, and suddenly clenched his 5 fingers, grabbing the body of the little bird, and then slowly began to tighten. The body of the little bird shook violently, and then its neck moved, and then the bird's head came out from under the wing and it lifted up. It looked the same as when Luchin first saved it except for its eyes. Its eyes were completely dyed red as if blood was flowing, and after a while, there was even a drop of blood dripping from the edge of the little bird's eye sockets. The little bird's pair of blood-red eyes stared at Luchin, and then it cried out. The sound was mournful and sharp, as if it had seen a great enemy with a blood feud, as if it could not wait to eat its flesh and drink its blood. Next to Luchin, Atsu slowly stood up, its eyes flashing with blood-red light, and it opened its mouth with its sharp fangs, like a ferocious evil beast. Puff! Suddenly, a muffled sound interrupted all sounds and then it stopped abruptly. A cloud of blood splattered in the air, and the little bird disappeared from Luchin's palm, leaving only feathers, broken limbs and flesh fluttering in the air. There was blood slowly dripping from Luchin's palm. He glanced at his palm and then turned around again, this time standing in front of Atsu. He stared at Atsu's eyes and Atsu also looked back at him. Lu Qin stretched out his blood-stained hand and gently placed it on Atsu's head. Atsu's head and body seemed to shrink back instinctively, but it soon stopped. It just quietly looked at Lu Qin and then it did not move. Lu Qin gently stroked the hair on Atsu's neck and head, then he leaned forward and hugged its head in his arms. "You wanted to kill this bird, why?" Lu Qin asked in a very soft voice. Of course, Atsu could not speak, and its head was held in Lu Qin's arms so it could not move, so it just wagged its tail. Lu Qin became silent. His hand did not stop stroking Atsu. His face was stuck on Atsu's fur and he could no longer feel warmth. Finally it also felt cold. But he still saw Atsu wagging its tail at him. In his embrace, Atsu's head rubbed against him out of habit just like before. These were all engraved in their memories, the secrets that only belonged to him and Atsu, and no one could take them away. Except for death. "I think this should still be a dream," Lu Qin said in a low voice. "Atsu, we have to go out, right?" Atsu responded in a low voice. Lu Qin closed his eyes as he held Atsu in his arms. The hand that had been caressing Atsu suddenly stopped. It was the blood-stained hand that had come to rest on Atsu's neck. The surroundings suddenly became silent. A moment later, a sharp and shrill roar that seemed to be filled with rage suddenly rang out from inside and outside the long street in the distance. The roar came from all directions like a raging wave. The walls around the house began to creak and dust and gravel began to fall. From the corners and cracks, a dark red mist suddenly rushed in, like a demon baring its fangs and brandishing its claws, pouncing on Lu Qin. Lu Qin did not raise his head, and he did not even glance at the horrifying phenomenon around him with the corner of his eyes. He just hugged Atsu tightly, and his eyes were fixed on Atsu's body. For a moment he held his breath. He gritted his teeth. There was no medicine for regret in this world. If he did something wrong, what should he do? He had made a mistake, right? He closed his eyes and his mind suddenly went blank. However, he suddenly clenched his hand and a moment later, a ball of black fire suddenly surged out. Then with the ball of black fire in his palm, he directly destroyed the skin and flesh of Atsu, and broke the black dog's neck. Atsu roared in pain and struggled desperately, but its body was tightly held by Lu Qin, and it could not move. It could only watch in despair as the black fire completely swallowed it. In the next moment, their surroundings darkened. It was as if the raging tide of fog had completely swallowed Lu Qin and Atsu. Chapter 658. It was as if it was winter, very, very cold, or perhaps he had come to the legendary great ice fields of the north where every drop of water would freeze. Even the blood in his body felt like it was about to freeze. There was only darkness in front of him. He could not feel any light no matter how hard Lu Qin tried to open his eyes. Compared to the emptiness in front of him, his ears seemed abnormally chaotic and noisy. From time to time, many strange sounds rang out one after another. Sometimes it was a low wail and sometimes it was like a stormy sea, giving off a deafening sound. Sometimes it was the roar of a giant beast, and sometimes it was the roar of 1,000 ghosts. It was as if he had fallen into the underworld, into the boundless hell, and what awaited him was the painful fate of never being able to reincarnate. A trace of fear welled up in Lu Qin's heart. The unknown fate always made people like this, but he immediately reacted. He felt that his emotional reaction had finally returned to normal. This was the first time he felt happy for his fear. Following that, it seemed that the pain that the strange situation around him was exerting on him was rapidly weakening. The chill slowly faded. Lu Qin suddenly felt his body become light, and then his entire body seemed to be floating. The sounds around him disappeared, and the world suddenly became quiet. Then, in the darkness in front of him, there seemed to be a faint flicker of light in an extremely distant place. Lu Qin looked into the distance and felt that it was like a beam of starlight, faintly flickering in the deepest part of the night sky for millions of years. Then, in front of him, in this boundless darkness, like a silent and dark night sky, specks of starlight gradually lit up. They lit up the starry sky, emitting an ancient light. The starlight was clear and resplendent, like the most magnificent feast in the world unfolding in front of him. Lu Qin held his breath. At this moment, he had an urge to shout, but all the sounds were suppressed in his throat. He could only feel that he had lost control of his body, and just like that, he was floating casually and quietly in this void filled with starlight. Lu Qin stared at the sky full of stars and suddenly understood something. It was as if some kind of power had activated the lock that had been sealed in his heart for many years. Then it quietly wiped away the dust and released the sealed past. Suddenly, his pupils dilated, and his eyes reflected the dazzling starlight in the sky, and an enormous shadow descended from the sky. It was an unimaginably huge tree, a tree that was constantly growing, sprouting, and spreading countless branches into the void. The huge tree stretched across the great and vast starry sky, many of its branches inserted into the gaps between the stars and darkness. In some places, Lu Chen even saw those strange branches reverberating with familiar dark flames. Then they pierced through the void, creating waves of ripples that reflected fragments of a strange world, and then pierced into that world. But before he had time to think about it, or even before he had time to be shocked by this huge tree, he found that he did not feel the slightest fear or dread in the face of such a terrifying divine tree. He almost thought that there was something wrong with his emotions again, that he had returned to that strange and terrifying nightmare. But very soon he found that this was not the case. He was not afraid, nor was his emotions cold and unresponsive. On the contrary, he felt a sense of familiarity with this huge tree in the void. It was a familiar feeling of warmth, as if he had met an old acquaintance that he had not seen for many years. As if responding to his strange feelings, the huge tree in the starry sky suddenly split off a branch, passing through countless stars in the void. In the blink of an eye, it passed through the darkness and stretched out in front of him. There were green leaves and buds on the branch, full of vitality. Even the darkness and the void could not stop this vitality, and it seemed to reflect a layer of green in Lu Chen's eyes. Lu Chen was deep in thought, looked down at his chest and found a ray of light emitting from his heart. The light was flickering, warm and peaceful, and it happened to be of the same origin as the branch of the divine tree in front of him. At that moment, Lu Chen's mind suddenly became clear. He did not know how the scene before him had happened, but he knew that all of this must have been caused by the seed of the tree of God in his body. It had resonated with the tree of God in the distant starry sky, which was why everything before him had happened. It turned out that the divine tree in the legend of the evil faction really existed, and from the magical scene in front of him, it was even greater and more magical than the legend that the evil faction worshipped and believed in. In front of Lu Chen, the branch trembled, looking a little hesitant and puzzled, probably did not understand why the seed did not leave Lu Chen's body, but was always hidden in his body. The branch slowly stretched out and gradually wrapped around Lu Chen's body. Lu Chen could do nothing about it. He had a hunch in his heart that if the branch of the divine tree exerted force, he would be smashed to pieces at any time. But he did not feel afraid because the light in his heart was still bright, and the seed seemed to be firmly expressing its attitude. After an unknown period of time, the branch seemed to have finally accepted reality. It gently patted Lu Chen's body a few times as if it was reluctant to part, but finally decided to leave. The branch slowly loosened from Lu Chen's body, but before it left, this vigorous branch full of indescribable life aura, suddenly shone brightly. A strong and abundant spiritual power suddenly poured into Lu Chen's body, like a flood rushing through Lu Chen's meridians, and then converged into the most secret place in his heart, where the seed was. The light emitted by the seed instantly became several times brighter. Then the light flickered and continuously flickered several times, as if it was thanking the branch. The branch that came from the void slowly left Lu Chen's body, and then shrank back, returning to the eternal silence and starry night sky. The light in Lu Chen's eyes and the incomparably huge shadow of the divine tree gradually disappeared into the darkness. It was as if this miraculous scene had never happened. If it wasn't for the fact that his body was still filled with powerful life force, if it wasn't for the fact that the seed in his heart was still shining brightly. The next moment, suddenly, the world was silent, and there was only darkness in front of him. All the starlight disappeared and all the sounds became silent. He fell from the void as if he had fallen into a bottomless abyss, but in the end he only felt his body suddenly shake, and a familiar feeling surged in his heart. That was the familiar bed he slept on last night, right? Before he could open his eyes, he suddenly heard the sound of a dog barking. Then there was a familiar voice with some impatience shouting not far from him, "Hey, it's daybreak. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.